Kia ora tātou. Welcome back again to this council meeting, the long-term plan one. We're on to item 27, the capital budget options. No, we have not. Yes, 28. Sorry, we're on to 28. Capital budget option tertiary precinct, page 245. Welcome, Sandy. Welcome, Richard. Do you want to introduce it or just take questions? Councillor Benson Pope, questions.
Thank you. Councillors will be aware of the two groups that liaise with the university, one at the mayoral level and then the worker bees down the chain who meet in sequence with that meeting and chaired by Councillor Wilson. And I know I'm a member of that group. I know how long the discussions have been going about trying to work alongside the university to improve the edges of the campus and improve the safety and the amenity in some of those surrounding streets and so on. I think it will be helpful if you give us a background to the length of that conversation and perhaps some reference to the discussions that were came out of the Chow Hill report and so on.
Yes, certainly. I think this project was going, or the discussions on this were going longer than I've been involved in it, which is an indication of how long it's been around. So I know it was in the previous long-term plan as an unfunded item, a request to be discussed at last year's annual plan. At last year's annual plan, it hadn't progressed just through not having the appropriate resources to move it on, although the conversations with both the tertiary partners had been continuing. The Chow Hill report, which was endorsed or it was procured as a joint exercise with those three groups and then endorsed, sets out again a vision for the tertiary precinct, and the next stage is getting that vision into a project where there can be some physical work occurring on the ground. So it is still very much supported by the other partners. It would be fair to say that the university has progressed significantly. The Polytech have obviously have a lot of work going on as well, but we haven't progressed our work in the public realm, which is what this project seeks to address.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you very much for the report. I just want to, I think we've workshopped this, but can you just outline the streets that are involved, if possible? It's not just the one-ways.
So the streets, or the tertiary precinct, is a larger area than the priority streets that will be picked up as part of this project. So the tertiary precinct, which is bounded by Dundas Street, the one-way southbound, Albany Street, but even then with the number of tertiary residents or rentals just outside of that area, it almost extends a little bit further. The priority streets for this, which are being driven or again being connected through the requirements to upgrade the water infrastructure under the ground, will be Albany Street between the one-way southbound and Anzac Avenue. It will be Union Street between the University and Anzac, be Harbour Terrace outside the Polytech, so between St David Street and Union Street, and it will be Clyde Street between Albany and Union. So those are the four priority areas, and then subject to other infrastructure upgrade requirements, it might just extend a little bit further than that if necessary.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Obviously doing work in this neighbourhood can be logistically challenging, and given the capacity of contractors that currently exist to be able to do this kind of work, are we confident that it can be managed in such a way that most of the disruption occurs in the summer period? Because were it to happen in the middle of a semester, that will be interesting to see.
We're not far enough through that process to understand what a program might look like. I think it would be fair to say there will have to be some disruption during semester. Just the scale of this would require there to be some work, but we would have to work closely with both the university and the Polytech to talk about what would be an appropriate level of disruption at any time. We have had interest from contractors outside of Dunedin who specialise more in the open space streetscape work, who are aware that both this project and the central city are being considered at the moment. So there might be some other opportunities for more contract or interest in these projects.
And just one more, if I may. I understand that this is all very high level, and no doubt we'll see more detailed design as that goes through, but what kinds of treatments and approaches are being discussed at this point?
At this point, the Chow Hill report has a lot of similar concepts to that has been discussed in terms of the central city plan. So far more shared spaces or treatments on the at the entrance to the tertiary precinct to make it clear that you are entering a zone that is used slightly differently to many of our streets, just with the number of pedestrians circulating in the area. So paving, artwork, more seating, planting, investigation of things like rain gardens to treat stormwater and that sort of thing. So it was looking at those sort of developments and treatments.
And I mean, you outlined the boundary of the area. Are NZTA involved? I know one of the challenges is the crossing, the Albany Street crossing with the one-way north, which we don't have any direct control over in a planning sense. But are they amenable to making that desire line more user-friendly and safer for pedestrians?
Yes, they're happy to, or they've indicated that they're happy to be involved in the project and the planning to try and make sure that intersection works.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple of questions. I see that the Chow Hill report was a shared cost amongst the parties. Is there any likelihood that once the development work starts, that there may be some contribution from the parties in terms of the street hardware or the artwork or other things to enhance the project?
Yes, so both parties have indicated that there is an opportunity for support, and we've said that subject to a decision through the long-term plan, we would sit down and have those discussions. There's a few things there. There could be direct financial support, possibly, but there's also the opportunity for in-kind support. So we know that the Polytech have expressed an interest in having their students involved with public art or design of infrastructure and that sort of thing. So we would look to take those opportunities. We're discussing at the moment with the university the potential to share project management resource with all their work that's going on and our heavy workload. The project management resource across the city is tight, so there's other ways they might contribute in kind, but we've agreed that subject to the outcome of the long-term plan process, we would then sit down and have those discussions.
So within the report we have three options, and the moderate investment option is in our budget. Could you give me some advice on what is the difference between the moderate and the high? Like this is the university precinct, the tertiary precinct, is one of our biggest economic drivers, and obviously we want to try and enhance that area, enhance the potential to attract good staff, good students into that area, and therefore build our reputation as a city of knowledge. So my tendency is to think that we should be taking the $20 million option, but perhaps you could clarify for me what we would miss out on at going at the 11.3.
So much like the central city plan we discussed yesterday, the Chow Hill report was developed using three levels of development. They call it high, medium and low. It's been gold, silver, bronze, whatever you want to call it. And that refers really just to the types of treatments that might be applied to each area. So if you were going to pave all the streets, for example, which is significantly more expensive but gives you a better urban design outcome. In many cases, the type of infrastructure that might be added, the type of treatment at the entrance points to the tertiary precinct at key intersections. So it just allows I suppose more investment in the types of treatments that we would apply, and it would also mean we would be able to include more than the 4 areas that have originally been budgeted for. So it would give us greater scope to extend a little bit further past those areas to create more of that precinct.
So if we were of a mind to run with the $20 million option, how would that sit in terms of support from the tertiary precinct?
So the tertiary precinct, and you have to excuse me if I get the names of the groups, the planning group, which I think is where the report went, correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor, had indicated support for the 11 million in terms of the level of investment in these streets. So what that allows is a medium level investment with some targeted high level investment in specific locations, and there was comfort that would give the outcome that the three parties were seeking, which is why that's our recommended option.
So, you know, one of the things that sticks in my mind is if you have an asphalt road, you have a road. If you have an asphalt street, then it is a road. And so the paving option, to me, has some design benefits in that it clearly can indicate that it's not a road. And I tend to think that our immediate tertiary campus should be a pedestrian, a people zone, not a car zone. Not that cars would not be allowed to go through there, but it should be seen that way. So it concerns me a little bit if that was going to be the compromise between 11.3 and 20, that we would just continue to have chip-sealed roads through normal footpaths at the side, and it just still is a traffic zone. So is that, am I reading it right, that that's what the compromise would be?
It could be. It's difficult to say without having gone through the details as to what we're trying to achieve in each of those streets. So there still needs to be a balance between the needs of pedestrians and people circulating and the need for traffic to circulate. And some of those streets, like Albany, for example, are reasonably busy streets, and provision for pedestrians may be made through wider footpaths or better formed crossing points, without necessarily turning the whole road into a shared space or a paved space. So there may be some compromises with the medium level option, but we're still comfortable, based on what was produced in that Chow Hill report, that level of investment would provide for the outcomes that the partners were seeking as far as their students or staff who are in that precinct.
Thank you.
I have been lucky to get to one focus group meeting, but I've only got a rough idea of this plan, to be honest. But I noted in it that in Albany Street, actually I thought at that point it was going up as far as the one-way north. But regardless of whether it's the one-way north or one-way south, it's actually within 1 to 2 blocks of the end of the Centre City plan now, which is going to go George Street up to Albany Street. So given that we are almost touching with these two things, should we be considering making sure they do effectively touch?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very good point. I think through the process we would possibly find that would be the outcome that we would look for. If the central city started at Albany, George, and the tertiary precinct was stopping at Albany and the one-way south, there is some work through the current urban cycleway package, that mid-block or the crossing between the one-ways on Albany Street, and looking at some upgrades there, which would effectively only leave us one block that hasn't had work, which I think we would find would be captured in either the central city or tertiary.
I think, looking at the plan, it looks more, it's got, Harbour Terrace on it, and it seems to be more focused towards the Logan Park end of the tertiary sector, but the life sciences go as far over as Frederick Street, and in fact there's a substantial amount of pedestrian movement from what you call the main campus over to the medical campus, and if you don't get to the one-way north, you won't capture any of that desire line. So that's another thing to consider. I know this is a budget discussion, but it will affect the budget.
And the NZTA are also looking at those desire lines from the university across to Great King, across the one-way north. There is that crossing point that is effectively used by most people beside the physio school, that it isn't currently controlled, and they're looking at how better to form that for people just because they're aware of the numbers using it. So we are talking to them about how that precinct operates.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Chris asked my questions, so I'm quite happy to pass on that.
Thank you. In background on 245, it says that the aim of the tertiary precinct safety accessibility upgrade is going to have particular emphasis on streetscape and pedestrian cycling environment. How do you achieve an accessibility upgrade for the cycling environment when the university won't allow a cycleway through their campus? Are we going to be rerouting cyclists around the campus on DCC streets?
So the current the plan for within the tertiary precinct is to allow cyclists to get either to the destination or to get past the university or to other locations using the street environment. So that is how this would be developed.
So you're simply accepting that the university won't allow any cycleway through the campus, and we're going to spend a lot of ratepayers' money going around it as a result.
There has been discussions with the university about the reason that they don't allow cyclists through the campus is somebody was hurt on campus, was hit by a cyclist, killed. And there has been discussion about having good, safe cycleways so that is avoided, and those discussions are underway. So at this point I wouldn't be able to say that's definitely changed, but certainly discussions are being held as part of the whole tertiary precinct upgrade to change that, potentially.
Given that there is the potential for changing that, should we not wait until we know whether or not the university is going to allow cycleways through their campus before we spend a whole lot of money rerouting cyclists around the campus?
So that this wouldn't reroute them. This would provide safe access to both tertiary providers and an option for people should they be going past the university. But I wouldn't consider it a rerouting of cyclists around there. We would be seeking to provide safe streets right through that precinct for people who are using cycling or walking as their mode of transport.
Thank you.
I've got two questions. The first one is, my understanding is the university have already started this process in their work in Castle Street North, so that they've already put dollars in the game. And just understanding on the scale of things, the work that they've done, and I think I've actually gone to the annual plan. I was more prepared yesterday for this debate than I am right now. But that street has 1,500 square metres, according to their annual plan. What would you say that scale of work was done to? Was it the high, low or medium?
Sorry, Councillor, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to put a figure on that at this stage. I'd have to check with the university.
Okay, no, and the only reason it doesn't give the quantum that it's going to invest in that, but if it was at high, which I personally, having seen that area, would say it probably was, that's equivalent to doing Bath Street at high, which is 3.8 million. I'm just trying to tabulate the reports that we do have, which shows the sort of contribution that the university's already put into it. And it's a very, very nice scale. The other question I had is understanding the question that Councillor Staines asked about paving and how that affects people's concepts of pedestrian, because if you keep it at asphalt, whatever treatment you almost give to it, cars still feel like that's their place. And your experience, I think, elsewhere, possibly with Fort Street or in other areas in other cities, where they've changed the pavement, my understanding is that it has a very big difference on people's perceptions. Is that your experience?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just following up on Councillor Wilson's question, and it's a question I asked yesterday, I just seek reassurance that this is being approached not as a streets, footpaths, with a bit of landscaping on the side, but as a holistic design approach. I guess I'm looking at it through an urban geography lens, but I just need reassurance that that's the case.
Yes, that's the case. So the Chow, which essentially sets the framework for this, is focuses on the urban design outcomes, right. And then the infrastructure will be built.
Thank you.
From there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Richard, when I look at the difference between option 1 and option 2, where does safety fit in? Do we increase the safety aspect? Because I see very little mention of safety actually as I read through the report. But yet the students in that whole area, safety to me would be a major issue.
Yeah, look, as it indicated in the background, the whole project and from a strategic point of view, as far as our NZTA document goes, it's a safety-driven project. So the outcomes we are seeking is to make sure that users in that precinct are safer, and we will either option will achieve that. How we get there, or the option that is preferred, will obviously dictate the level of investment, but both of them will create a safer environment.
So would we, and again, tough question, do we increase the safety aspect with the percentage of cost? So do we make it a third safer, 33% more safer because of the 33%?
I wouldn't be, I'm not comfortable that I can answer that, probably. Sorry, Councillor.
Okay. When we look at I take it when we look at option 2, and the quote, or paragraph 15, when we talk about NZTA funding of 3.6 million, is that on the 11.3 million?
Yes, it is. That's on the option that's included within the draft budget, which is the 11.3, and that's on the basis that we believe NZTA will fund the safety and accessibility components of the project, but may not fund all of the urban design amenity upgrades. But that's still subject to a business case process, and that number may change. But that's based on the $11 million option.
So if we went to a 20 million, there's a potential of 5 million NZTA.
Potentially, we would have to work through that business case with them.
Okay. I'm trying to position this because it does work with some of my thoughts on how I'm going to vote on this. What happens? Is there any discussion taking place around? And you touched on it with Councillor O'Malley's questions around the whole connection of the hospital precinct area and things like that.
Yes, there is. So the central city plan and the tertiary precinct will have to connect. I mean, there's a key connection there between the university and the hospital, or the central city in general, with the numbers of people that use those areas. So there will need to be good connections and safe connections, crossing points, working with infrastructure that's already being built or is planned to be built. So those projects will run in parallel effectively.
Okay, so even though I didn't support the 60 million yesterday, this would have the potential, for example, someone coming from the Polytech, moving through the campus precinct, across through to George Street and down through to the Octagon, covering the ideal big picture of what it would all look like, and even down through to the exchange area.
Yeah, absolutely. So they would experience slightly different treatments on the journey, but effectively it would be a connected journey.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just being clear, this $11 million won't cover you all the way down to Rattray Street, right? We're not double dipping.
Councillor Laufisa.
This question probably isn't for Mr. Saunders. I'm just sorry for my lack of concentration, but if we select one option, say the $20 million option, in terms of the consultation document, do we include another option for consulting?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just the hospital rebuild and how it affects the centre city. I was just wondering around timing of this project in relation to knowing where the hospital sits, etc.
Look, I'm comfortable that we could continue the planning for this until the point in time where we know what the outcome of the hospital rebuild is. The tertiary precinct can be designed and then can accommodate that at a later date, once we know, and working closely with the university, the arrangements for any medical school or teaching activity that occurs and what the desire lines might be for those students. So they could be worked in once we're aware of what that decision is.
Yes, Your Worship. I'm going to vary from the report, I think, for the first time. I apologise for that, not. And I'd like to consult with our community on the $20 million option, because I've had the pleasure of sitting on, and sorry, I'll wait for a second. Thank you. The reason I'd like to talk to this, I've had the privilege of being on the tertiary precincts now for a number of years, and understand how important this is and the importance of a good, healthy campus to the university's growth and the Polytech's growth. And that is about being pedestrian friendly. It's about them taking over the streets as theirs when they're operational, but also making them throughways for other traffic. And there's a real challenge there, but they have to be safe, and they are students. And so this is really concentrating on doing and the long-term investment is, it's a long-term picture that we're looking at here. So I have done the analysis of 1,500, and I may be completely wrong, that 1,500 metres squared that the university has already invested in, which I would put at the high end, and in Castle Street. If that was Bath Street, it was in our books at 3.8 million. So that shows the sort of level that the university are already committing to this. I have to say that on top of that, the public art that they've put in Union Street and other areas around there is fabulous as well. So I think there's traction. They've got traction. They've got the alumni interested in these in this work. So the reason I'm going for 20 million is that I think it will still cost us the same amount, because we'll get other money in. If we don't go for this if we just go for the 11.3 million, I think that's all we'll get. We won't get a lot of buy-in, because it's not going to be of the quality that the other institutions will probably engage at that higher level. So my option 20 is on the basis that I expect other partners to come in, and the net effect will be the same. So can we put that in the budget that way? That we put in 20 million, but on the basis that we'd expect the contribution from the other, because we've done that with other projects.
We have, but usually we have an indication of that contribution at the beginning. It's pretty hard for us to put that in. We then have no offset line, and you push us over our debt cap without no. But we're certainly going to have those discussions between now and while the document's out for consultation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm comfortable with that, because I think this is about us setting the putting a mark in the sand, and I'm happy to see where that goes as part of that. So that's why I'm going to be putting it. I appreciate that will cause us some issues.
So you'll put it at 20, 11?
No, 20, but with the contributions.
Except we can't put a contribution in, because we haven't asked anybody for a contribution.
Well, just put it in 20. Put it in 20.
Put in 11.
Put in 20 and consult on that.
Except that what you'll do is push us over our debt cap, and then we'll end up with a qualified audit or issues with audit. So we just need to work out what to take out at that point. So we can do that. We can do that work.
We'll extend the time frame that the project.
Yeah,
and
okay.
that
Extend
would be
the time frame for the project.
I'm happy either way. I think that's part of the conversation. The problem is that the university and the Polytech have been waiting for us to act before they will commit. And I think, given that there's significant events happening in the university in the next few years, this would give a project that the university alumni for their 150th can actually assist with. And that gives some focus. So I think there are some good conversations, but they have been begging us to put this on the agenda so that they can start saying what they'll put in. It's not, it's chicken and egg stuff. And I'm sorry, it's the way it is.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I don't know why this suddenly got more complicated than it needs to be. I think we're all only too aware of the importance of the campus as the city's biggest industry, actually, although that's a bit deprecating to talk about education as an industry. But we know there are 20,000 odd students in that large campus for the two institutions and the ancillary stuff all over various parts of the precinct. And we know that they move around, and a lot of them don't move around with a great degree of safety at the moment, actually. If you've had the good fortune to look at Castle Street North that Councillor Wilson's already referred to, you'll know that it's top-end treatment, and it's really exciting, actually, not just the threshold treatment outside coming up to Selwyn, but the work all the way down to St David Street is absolutely stunning. And that's even without talking about the brilliant restoration they did on the cottage, on the old villas, to turn derelict villas into 3 state-of-the-art healthcare, childcare centres. So no one should have any doubt about the commitment of the university and the University Council to really high-quality street works, and they've shown that at that end. And I think if you haven't been down Dundas Street and had a look at the threshold treatment, you need to, because I think it really shows the way for what we can do right around the campus. The other extraordinary contribution that the university makes to our economy and our city, apart from the population issue, is the public art that is already in our environment. And if you walk from St David Street back through to Union Street, you'll get a good idea of the extraordinary money that has actually gone into creating the sort of beautiful environment that is so important to attracting students and keeping them on our campus. And the only other place I'd ask you to visit for a bit of a taste is to walk along what's now called Leith Walk, according to the DCC web map, which is a bit of Union Street over the bridge, where it's just all been re-landscaped as well, between the registry and the sort of student centre, where there is an extraordinary Dibble sculpture that went in. You wouldn't buy it with our sculpture fund, but it was donated by the Halls Trust, who have come to see us about something else. You know the one I mean. And I suggest that when you visit it, do it in the evening, because it is even better with the buried lighting that is in places around it as part of the sculpture. But what I'm saying is the campus is a stunning area internally, and we often talk about town and gown and our relationship, and I don't think we've walked the walk in recent times. And worse than that, I think we've dragged the chain in not meeting our civic responsibilities to make those links. I'm delighted to hear the reference that's been made by a couple of speakers, including Mr Saunders, to the decision about going to Albany Street with the George Street stuff. I think is very bright, and the obvious connection to Albany Street improvements is self-evident, that you'd want to have that design line properly treated, as you would what happens in Frederick Street, and I guess that will come later. And I'm sure when the hospital gets built, wherever it gets built, there'll be other challenges for us then. What councillors will remember is that when the university asked us, before the IS building, what used to be the library, was opened by whichever royal was here to do it, they asked us to spend, I think, $100,000 or $150,000 on a bit of paving to make the area look nicer, and we couldn't do it. And I think we should be embarrassed about that. I haven't forgotten, they might have. But that Albany Street area between the Clubs and Societies building and the IS building is dangerous, it's unfriendly, it's unwelcoming, and that, along with Harbour Terrace and the links back up across those dangerous areas on the highway, I think are all part of this. So please, if unfortunately won't be able to before we vote, but you'll be able to before any work comes back or before any consultation, or other way round, you know what I mean. Go and have a look at those threshold treatments in Castle Street North and the paving treatments, because it will help people get their head around what the possibilities are for George Street and elsewhere as well. It's beautiful. So please don't worry too much about whether the university's on board. They're well and truly on board, and we're the ones who are dragging the chain. And I know the Polytech have also talked extensively about, as was mentioned, about using their people to do a lot of the work, and we know how important and innovative the art school is. So I think there's potential for some further really exciting developments here to make our campus even better than it already is.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a question for starters, if you'll indulge me, and it's around the issue that was discussed previously around the debt cap. Is the issue for us whether we sit under that at the end of this meeting or whether we sit under that at the end of the May meeting?
Yep, that's look. A couple of things about the debt cap. You can change it. We have proposed to you that the maximum debt for council, inflation adjusted, remain the same as at the last long-term plan because of decisions that were made and a feeling around the table at the last long-term plan. So you can elect to have a higher debt cap, so that's the first thing. I've just spoken with the team, or texted backwards and forwards to the team. We can come pretty close to getting the $20 million with no contribution and then stay under that debt cap. There's a couple of issues with timing because the inflation adjustment doesn't all happen right at the beginning, is when the peaks of that debt are in terms of sale, particularly of things like Wall Street, which take a little bit of time if that's where we go, and there's a resolution to sell Wall Street already on the books. So, but yes, so it's voluntary. The question is, if you wanted to have that as your debt cap, you should have a plan for the next 10 years that see you staying under that cap for each of those 10 years after you finish your final consultation round, not now.
And just for absolute clarity, it's our self-imposed financial strategy rather than any statutory debt cap, which does exist.
Oh, absolutely, it is our self-imposed, and it's worth reminding you again, and you'll see the financial strategy, we'll discuss that later, but we have set our financial cap at noticeably lower than the financial cap that's set by the local government funding authority. So we could have a debt cap that's considerably higher than it is and still be well within the bounds of what local government funding authority thinks is reasonable, and other councils have. We have been very prudent with our debt cap.
Thank you. And just speaking to this briefly, I almost think sometimes it's disappointing when things like this get presented to us as tertiary proposals, because it can be quite easy then to pigeonhole it as something that we are investing in solely for the benefit of the staff and the students at our tertiary institutions, when it's absolutely clear in my mind that these are facilities and institutions that are of huge benefit to the whole community and the whole city, and not just in the obvious economic ways that have already been canvassed, but these are they're fairly pivotal to our social and cultural and academic life in terms of lifelong learning. And if people haven't availed themselves of the fine public lectures and public programs that the university offer free of charge, I recommend that you do investigate them, because they are great, and it's phenomenal to have that kind of resource and that kind of research and expertise made available to us. But also it functions with the support of the university in particular, I suppose, as very fine public recreational space, which we are not necessarily over-endowed with in our central city area, and I think it has been noted, the investment that the university have put into that, and that is something that we can all benefit from. But this is in consideration of all of the reports and all of the proposals that are coming before this meeting, is quite phenomenal to think that we're taking in an area that goes from Police Street through to the Botanic Gardens, down to Logan Park, back around to the waterfront and over, and then eventually, when our friends at NZTA get on board, back right round through from Portobello to Port Chalmers. I mean, that is a truly phenomenal amount of work, and any chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and so to do any of those bits in a once-in-a-generation opportunity on the cheap would weaken and cheapen, I think, all of those very grand visions and facilities. I mean, we have to include a second option, so that's fine. We can have that conversation, but you know, I just really wanted to reiterate the point that it isn't just staff and students that will see the benefit of this, and particularly so when the safety, the fruits of the safety focus come to bear in terms of making it safer and more accessible for people to access that part of town. So I support this. Thanks.
When we go forward to vote for this and look at option 1, we need to look at number 14 in the funding sources option, which is whether other people will come to the table with the money here. And I think that I would like to see that sit high in the consulting document, that in fact we are looking for the university and the Polytech to contribute significantly here. Otherwise this burden is unfairly shared, I feel. I support this, and I do very much like the idea of this investment. I do remind everybody at this room, though, that the city does not exist just between the Botanic Gardens and the Oval. And when we describe the city, I want us to include South Dunedin in our descriptions, because we are investing heavily into the north end of the city again, and we seem to always forget that there is another part of the urban section of Dunedin. I'm forgetting the very vast extent of the city. And I would hope that in the future, as we look at major urban spends, we remember the rest of our ratepayers as we go forward and do consider what we're going to do on King Edward Street as we do consider what we're doing on George Street and the tertiary precinct. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm following up sort of on Councillor Hawkins' question about debt caps, and I'd just like to acknowledge Mr. Logie for advising Rachel, Councillor Elder and I and me that there is no stupid question. So I hope that I preface my stupid question with that. So I remember saying at the beginning of these proceedings on Monday that I am in favour of substantial investment in our city, in our people, but I wanted to make sure that we do increase our social or our community spending and encouraging people in terms of biodiversity and climate change, etc. So my stupid question is, if we were to go above the recommended 6.9% increase in terms of rates, what would that affect our debt cap, or what are the implications?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, so to some degree, the two things are independent. Rates pays for your operational expenses, and we also directly rate to cover our renewals. Debt covers new builds. It's a very broad generalisation, but broadly. So you can borrow for new builds. You could make your debt cap $100 million higher if you wanted, borrow another $100 million. In the out years, you would have interest repayments, and they come off, you have to rate for that. And you would also have an increase in renewals. So we tend to think that when you budget for a $20 million piece of new build, you should have about, once it's built, $400,000-ish extra in the budget each year for renewals, about 2%. So they are linked. In terms of operational expenses, you can increase your operational expenses and increase the rates to cover that and have no impact on your debt ceiling at all if it's for the day-to-day operational expenses, which includes staffing, rent, grants, that kind of thing. Is that?
Yesterday and today we've heard about a lot of road treatments, street treatments, streetscapes, and I am very wary that we can over-treat, and very wary that we're going to make some of our streets and remove the vehicles from all the streets or a lot of the streets, and I'm getting very conscious of that fact. We do have to have mobility through the city, so I really see that as a key factor.
A point of order. Just for clarification, I don't think anybody's made any suggestion that would be removing vehicles from all streets or even many streets. So can I get clarity on that, please?
So at this stage, no decisions have been made on whether or not vehicles would be removed from any streets, and that's the process that needs to be worked through. And you can achieve both It's not one or the other, which hopefully that clarifies.
Yep. No, I could be happy to debate that, but I won't. But I am wary of where some of our decision process is going in that area. But the key thing that I do think is that we are going out for consultation on this. And I think that's what really, in this case, I can support the council preferred option of a 20 million for renewals and streetscape improvements across the tertiary sector. But also I can support it because there is good partnerships that we will essentially tap into and work with and make the area a lot safer for all the users in that area. And also I actually do like bringing it all together around the whole city. So I will be supporting this for consultation.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to begin by reminding myself and articulating that we are going out for consultation. And I was interested yesterday that somebody said to me, having heard on national radio some of the things we discussed yesterday, that they were a fait accompli, that we were doing them. It's easy to lose in amongst these conversations. If you were to parachute in, you may think that we had decided something when in fact we are deciding to go out for consultation to ask the community what they think about these things. So I'm just reminding myself of that. I'm reminded of Councillor Lord's comments yesterday, I think it was, around regretting sometimes having done something on the cheap. And so I see this as setting the tone, really, and again, giving the best vision, and you can always claw back from that if need be, depending on what the community says. I think too, when I'm considering my vote on this, to see the wider view of our tertiary institutions in this area and how people offshore view our city for its amenity values around safety, which is always important to improve. And I take the point that safety is a safety project to a wider extent, and safety's mentioned many times. But both safety and amenity value is important to the people who come here or choose to come here to go to our tertiary institutions. So we're setting the tone, and I'm very mindful too that if we put all of these projects together, should the community come back and say, yes, we want you to do these things, that we're joining the dots. If we were to join the dots around all these projects, my goodness me, what a city we're going to have. And that vision is what persuades me to support the first option.
Thank you, Worship. I'll try not to take too long. For me, I actually concur with Councillor Gary. We're talking about this bridge, joining the dots. That's going to be a first in the world. You know, the study centre down there. We've got one of the best universities in the world. There was some amazing marketing done on the back of our mighty Highlanders. You know, the University of Otago selling our university to the world. It is really highly regarded. There is a safety issues down there at times, and people sometimes don't want to send. They're worried about the safety of their young coming to our university. If we set the tone, as the councillor has also said, that is it a safe environment, it's a shared space, then those parents are going to be only too willing to spend their big dollars on putting their children through our university. What I see, you know, we have the couch fires going on down there and things like that. It'll actually, I think, also enhance the views of the students that they've also got to look after their environment as well and not wreck it. If the house down there or the garden looks horrible and dank and dirty, then they're not going to care. They're going to continue lighting fires. But if we actually make it an absolute stunning environment, then they're actually going to appreciate it a lot more and actually look after it. And then obviously that helps our safety issue with those parents moving forward as well for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I definitely support this resolution. And again, I'll just stress that I think here we are talking about the economic prosperity of our city. If we take a look at the themes that run through our economic development strategy, then it clearly identifies the fact that this city is, its future is moving towards being a city of knowledge, a city that bases its success on a growing contribution in terms of the weightless product economy. So I think with the 2 resolutions that we have made to consult on yesterday, the bridge to the harbour side, and therefore the support of the Van Brandenburg concept for that development, the redevelopment of our main street, and now the tertiary campus, we definitely have a linked set of projects that will give the city an opportunity to take a step up. This is definitely going to move our economy forwards, and it's a chance for all of our residents to express their views on the opportunities that are here for them to take, to share a vision of where our city is going to be. And that is, we are going to be a world-leading small city, we are going to have a beautiful environment in which to live, and we are going to have an infrastructure, because all of this is infrastructure, that will support and attract high-tech businesses, high-level students, high-level lecturers, and at the end, put us in a much better financial position as a city. So I absolutely support the $20 million option.
Worship. I concur that I feel safe that we can take this vision to our community and they can get involved and make their decisions on this. But I do believe that Van Brandenburg has put in front of us a bold vision for the future, and that the city has embraced that with that 89% support. And I think the whole linking of the harbour side through to the town and through to the gown will create a cohesive and beautiful city. I do believe that partnerships with the retail sector, with the Polytech and the university will bring better results. And I believe that that consultation throughout the process of co-creating a city together will bring a vibrant and colourful city. So yes, I support the 20 million, but I believe that in partnership some of those costs can be saved or contributions can be made that will make it a viable option for the city going forward.
Community feedback last night on Facebook was 30 against and 2 for the spend up we're currently indulging. Our consultation procedures and the feedback that we see here will not reflect that. Our formal consultation procedures will basically be from those same interest groups that I've been seeing coming back again and again since 2004, the squeaky hinges that will basically bend our debt to record levels again, and for little benefit in terms of what infrastructure is really required. Needed infrastructure is mostly subterranean. It's drains, it's cables, it's things that without which we can't operate properly, and a lot of it we have currently is simply not up to scratch. Councillor O'Malley effectively defeated his own argument for pouring more money into the university area when he highlighted how little gets done for South Dunedin or the suburbs. Don't cry for me, South Dunedin. Don't cry for me, the suburbs, the ratepayers who are going to be paying to put all of this prettifying and cycling infrastructure into the university area when their own footpaths and their own roads remain patchy and not up to scratch. If we are going to keep throwing a whole lot of these suburban ratepayers' money at an area of town that routinely trashes the trees that we plant and burns holes in the asphalt that we lay down for them, hole burning, by the way, which has in some years cost us over $600,000 per year, then I think we are simply making a completely wrong decision. Councillor Wilson claimed that the university is waiting for us to act before they commit. This I can agree with. They've done it before. They wait for us to put in the parking. They wait for us to put in all the infrastructure around the stadium before they act, and their action has been not to provide the parking that they were supposed to or that they were mandated to, and not to provide what they said they were going to with the stadium. The stadium was supposed to guarantee an extra 1,000 students per year, and that was one of the arguments, basis that we built it on. The moment we'd built the stadium, the university kept their role. There were no extra 1,000 students. Just as if we go ahead and commit all this ratepayer funding supplied by the suburban ratepayers of the city to this one area, again, we will not get a contribution from the university, I believe, as we have in the past. The university won't even allow a cycleway through the campus because they know that if they don't, the ratepayers, fools that they are, will simply pay for all the cycleways and the loss of parking to run around them. Putting this kind of budget under the circumstances that we have in terms of our debt, and knowing that not only it will be suburban ratepayers that pay for all of this, but they will be paying interest rates on this now and well into the future, I believe is wholly inappropriate. The very basic option 3 maintenance, I think, is something which we could justify simply in terms of we do have to keep the university going, and yes, they are going very well, and yes, they have enormous amounts of money to spend on prettifying certain things within their campus. They have spent this money at the expense, essentially, of dumping a lot of their general staff and reducing and cutting back on a lot of courses. None of this bodes well for the ratepayers that we are supposed to represent. I believe that we need urgently to rethink this tertiary precinct $20 million spend. We need to urgently rethink the idea that the community are going to come back to us, the whole community, and tell us that what they really want to happen. Have a look on Facebook and see whether people really support their money going into this. Thank you.
Further speakers? Okay, speaking to this myself, can I first address, while it's current, the issue that Councillor Vandervis has raised about consultation? That we should only listen to the people who never speak to us is arrant nonsense. We can't. Obviously, we listen to the people who submit and who talk to us. So, as far as I'm concerned, that is a complete red herring. It's basically the old, the silent majority. I know I'm the only one who knows what the silent majority think. This issue is about consistency, it seems to me. We've got ourselves into, the council's got into a position now where it can do some active things to improve our city, to invest in our city's future, after several years of not being able to do it. And I feel that it would be a shame if we were inconsistent. It would be particularly a shame if we were inconsistent when our other partners, contrary to what's been claimed by 1 or 2 speakers, haven't done their bit. The university has invested millions already, and as I think Councillor Benson Pope said, we have not kept our side of the bargain. You only have to walk down North Castle Street and through various parts of the campus that used to be streets to see how much the university has invested. And I don't think we want to end up with a situation where we do the main shopping area and we get a vision going on the harbour side, and the university does its bit really, really well, and the Polytech contributes, and then there are some streets that just look a bit different. And we say, oh, they're the ones the council pays for. They're not as good. They're not quite up to scratch because the council only does the basics. I do agree with the concern that we've got to keep an eye on, and that is, as Councillor O'Malley pointed out, keep an eye on other parts of the city that we have a responsibility to as well. But on the other side, though, I would point out that we often talk about the university being the sort of economic driver of the city. Well, it is also the rate driver of the city, because the rates we collect off those intensively developed areas around the university are 3 or 4 times per square metre the rates we collect off any other part of the city. So we're actually we're rating that area quite heavily, and that's fine. That's what you expect but you've got in many cases on a standard quarter acre section you might have 20 people living, whereas in other parts of the city you've got 3. So we have a much higher rate take. So I support this. I support going out to our community and saying this is part of our vision of lifting the quality, creating a consistent high quality environment across our city. Do you agree? That's what I support doing with this, because I suggest that if we went out with a lesser suggestion, a lesser option, the community would assume that it was consistent with the other things we've already decided and would just say, well, that's fine. So I think we've got to give them the choice. We've got to tell them plainly what it implies for their rates and for our debt. But we have to, as I said right at the beginning of this meeting, we can't afford to patronise our community and only expect of them low expectations of us. We give them the chance to reach for the sky a bit. So I support this resolution.
Thank you. And I'm heartened for the support I've heard around the table. Just a couple of things. This is about consultation, and I confirm. I just want to reiterate, just because I put it up doesn't mean that I'll necessarily go for it if we don't get any traction with this at the hearings time. The second one is timing. I think what the university has shown by investing what I think is about 3.8 million already into this is that you don't have to do it all at once. And in fact, maintenance-wise, it's probably best that we don't, but that we do it as an iterative process as other developments happen. And that's actually much smarter. It also can work with the adjoining landowners a lot better. And what we don't want to do is to do everything and make the traffic down there even worse than it was when they did the Castle Street extension. So I understand all of that. What I love about this plan that we've been presented to, and congratulations to staff and to Dr. Bidrose especially, is that I think this plan provides for a lot in a lot of areas, and there's 38 million of investment in infrastructure and in South Dunedin, and I think some people may have overlooked that when they spoke, because that's what I've read into it, and so this isn't just about small parts of the city getting a lot. 38 million going into South Dunedin really excites me, and where that's going to happen. But it doesn't mean that it's a pipe, and I think that's some people missing that. I'm delighted in those people, including Councillor Steadman and Councillor Wiley, who've picked up the correlation between good design and not only safety but behaviour, and I think that's also really implicit in all of this, and why I'm really supportive of it, because I think some damage was done in a campaign for the university many years ago, which has had huge effects on even the marketing of the of the university in 10 years later. But this sort of stuff will show that the image of the city of the university has changed quite markedly. And the last one is, I think people aren't, and the privilege of sitting on the tertiary precinct is, I hear some really good stuff, and I know the investment into cycle infrastructure there leaves the city for dead when it comes to covered cycle parks and showers and all of those other things. The university are really serious about that stuff, and they have got a number of parks right round which shows that they are really captured by offering cycling as an alternative. My understanding last time when they invested in this prior to some deaths on the cycleway, they had 9% staff student, they'd got up to a very high level of 9% using cycles to get to work. That hopefully with the development of NZTA will be the lower end that they're looking for. And so despite what others may think about cycleway investment by the university, it is substantial. So I think this all meets. I'm really excited by this prospect, and I'm very glad to hear the support.
Okay, I'm going to put this, and I might as well do it for anything else does, and we'll do it by division.
Aye.
Yes. Aye.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor Mule.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman.
Aye.
Councillor Venkis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Councillor Wilson.
Aye.
Your Worship.
Yes.
Carried 13-2.
Is that right?
I voted yes.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to, while we reorder the deck chairs at the end of the Titanic.
She's turned us around.
I'm just going to rule out a 2-minute break. Righto, councillors, thank you for that break. Now we'll move on to item 29, page 252, the operating budget option, encouraging private investment in ecological restoration. Do you want to introduce it, or shall we just go straight to questions?
We'd like to go straight to questions, but first of all to introduce, most of you know Anna, I'm sure, but Michael Bathgate sitting behind us, who's one of our policy planners, who's done a lot of the work on this and is our natural environment specialist.
So he will be the one who will know the answers to the questions, no doubt. Okay, questions, councillors, in the first instance. Councillor Gary.
Could you tell me, thank you, Your Worship, could you tell me the difference that the Biodiversity Fund has made to private investment in this area as a mechanism?
That's a really difficult question to answer. I suppose anecdotally, our sense is that it is encouraging private landowners to do biodiversity work that they couldn't otherwise afford to do, or do more than they could otherwise afford to do. And I think certainly some of the work that's done is quite expensive, and there's no real economic return for people, so they do it, you know, for the passion or for the belief that it's a good thing to do. So unlike some other activities, there really is very little return for people undertaking this work on their own land.
Thank you, Your Worship. During the last grants subcommittee meeting, the subcommittee made a recommendation, passed a resolution recommending to council that the criteria for the biodiversity fund be reviewed. There's no mention of that in here, but is that something? Because I think it's relevant to this discussion, but I'm just wondering if that's progressing in any form or is in the work program at least. Are you aware of it?
I have to confess I'm not aware of it, but we will make a note of it now and make sure that that is actioned.
Okay. I just wonder whether it's worth, I mean, I can add it as a resolution as part of this to make it a direction from council rather than a recommendation from the subcommittee. So if that's helpful.
What's our relationship with the Otago Regional Council when it comes to these kind of outcomes? Do we have a joint approach, or are we approaching these separately?
Another interesting question. I think generally we have a good relationship with the Regional Council. We work together on a number of things. Biodiversity is how much effort the ORC puts into biodiversity, and what they do is, I guess, has been a point of contention. They do have a biodiversity program. It is very focused, and so this is not really done as a joint exercise. We'd welcome working more with the Regional Council in terms of the biodiversity program, but at the moment this is something that we do on our own and isn't something that we work jointly with them on, unlike some other activities.
So being in general support of this approach, is this potentially something that the ORC potentially should be doing more of, and one of the roles that we could play would be to suggest that, given that that is that they are more associated with the ecological side of the city potentially than we are, that we would like to see them maybe pick up some of this burden rather than us picking it up, maybe with or without a discussion with them?
I don't know that it isn't our responsibility as well. I certainly think the ORC has a role to play, but under the Resource Management Act, so do territorial authorities. It's not something that sits entirely with the Regional Council. I think the Regional Council rightfully have an expectation that we will also operate in this area, and certainly the programs that they do, they're more in the area of pest management in terms of biodiversity than we are. They're complementary, but I think the legislation is such that we both have responsibilities in terms of biodiversity.
So that effectively then our role is that we need to pick up some spot that the ORC does not perceive as their role, and that there is a gap there and it needs to be filled by somebody, and it's appropriate for us to fill that gap.
I think so. I think that what we do and what they do complement each other at the moment, and they do a lot of things around, there's the pest management. They do a lot of things around water quality, obviously, as well. I think we need to continue the conversation to see that the two programs complement each other going forward, but I do think that we both have responsibilities in this area, that it's not entirely Regional Council function.
So that would be the message as we consult with the public about investing in this, is in fact that this is not an exclusive ORC issue, but that there is also a role for the DCC to play here, and that this is the way in which we plan to play our role.
Absolutely, that's my opinion, and that's certainly what we've heard so far from the rural community through the course, particularly through the District 2GP hearings. We've heard quite a bit on this matter, and the community has said to us that they see us having a role in supporting them in this way.
I see in the Regional Council strategy that high on their priorities is to have a regional biodiversity strategy, and working with DCC, DOC, etc. So would some of this funding actually be working towards something that is shared?
The amounts that have been put forward in the options haven't included funding specifically for that. However, having said that, there is funding in the option 1, I think it is, that would enable us to have a dedicated staff member working in this area, which would certainly support us doing better liaison, not just with the community, but also with the Regional Council, DOC, and other people operating in this area. At the moment, it's really something that we have very little resource to support.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your mahi. I'm just following up on that point that you talked about having a dedicated worker. So forgive me if I've misunderstood. So the baseline of diversity data for 70,000, is that for the worker or?
So the worker is included in option 1 under provide support for landowners at a cost of 100K a year. So that's the staff member in option 1 only.
Okay, so in a so-called ideal world, and given that the challenges that we have to face in terms of turning our ecological approaches around, or trying to drastically undo some damage, would, in your opinion, $80,000 per year help to mitigate some of the damage that our society's done?
I think the $80,000 is based on a modest increase to the biodiversity grants. The grants are really more about protecting and enhancing what we have left. It is still a very small amount of money in the grand scheme of things, and I think the reason for suggesting a modest increase is to enable us to continue and do more of the same of what we're doing, but better resourced. Whether we are victims of our own success, and at the end of the day, in 3 years' time, that proves to not be enough, that can be revisited at that time.
Councillor, what would you suggest?
So I'm moving option 1 with the addition of clause D, requesting a review of the Biodiversity Fund grant criteria to align it with the objectives of Te Aotearoa. Yeah, thank you. Seems nominal, almost, in terms of the figures that we've been bandying around over the last few days, but the smaller the figure, the longer the debate often around this table, but hopefully not the case in this instance. A year or so ago, I had an approach from someone who was trying to work up a story for national publication on the most influential people in Dunedin City. And their greatest regret was that Dr. Glenn Hazelton had left by that point because he couldn't be included on the list. Such was the legacy that he left in the city and the work that he was done, and the work that he did in terms of supporting the restoration and redevelopment of the city's built heritage. So in what I will call the Hazelton defence, I think it's time that we took a similar approach to our natural environment in supporting the private restoration and of biodiversity, and particularly Indigenous biodiversity in the city. I know it's often more difficult around this table to argue in defence of more staff rather than more things, but nobody can question the value that Glenn brought in terms of building relationships with private owners, encouraging substantial private investment, and achieving council's objectives for us, or contributing significantly to achieving council's objectives for us. And I look forward to similar outcomes when such a person is employed to do this work in the biodiversity sphere. Currently, around clause D, currently the funding criteria for the grants subcommittee for the Biodiversity Fund framed by the biodiversity strategy, which predates the current strategic framework, and I think it's time to have a look at that in terms of realigning it with Te Aotearoa, our environment strategy. And one of the biggest challenges the committee has is that it essentially favours where an activity is taking place rather than necessarily what the activity is, and that if it's on a piece of QE2 covenanted land or an area of significant conservation value, that automatically makes it a priority for the fund regardless of what the project is. And I think we need to think a little bit wider than that, or at least give the committee the scope to think a little bit wider about a little bit wider than that. A lot of the focus of our discussions over the past few days have been around our urban area, but as Councillor Lord so often reminds us, the city is in fact 90% rural, and just because a lot of those areas aren't seen by a lot of people doesn't make them any less important. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to kick along some work in our rural environments. If you think heritage buildings are difficult to bring back from the brink, good luck doing it with an ecosystem. So it's, if anything, this is more urgent work to be done. The grants funding is match funded. For those who don't know, we only contribute 50% funding. The rest of it comes from the landowner. So that doubles the very, very modest increase that's been proposed in this. And the biodiversity baseline, it is an action essentially out of Te Aotearoa. It's hard to know what to improve on if we don't know what we have. And that's particularly difficult given that so much of this is in private hands, and it will be so much easier to do that work, I would imagine, if we have an ecologist on board who's going out and talking to farmers and meeting farmers and helping them through that process, helping them be the great conservationists we all know that they are. So I support this and fully endorse. Oh, and I mean, we can have an argument all day about what the regional council should or shouldn't be doing, but I don't think we have the luxury of sitting around waiting for them to fulfil their obligations, core or not. So I think we have to get on with it and do our bit, and hopefully, I mean, they will come on board and they can be complementary, and we can work in with whatever regional biodiversity strategy might eventuate. But this is a very modest commitment on our behalf to what is very important work. Thanks.
Could I just check a procedural matter? Can I speak to the motion if I'm not going to be here to vote? Great, excellent, thank you. So I will be supporting the motion. As somebody that lives in an area where there has been extensive work done in terms of pest management, and I know that's only part of the biodiversity management, I've seen firsthand the difference it's made. Extraordinary work done by the Otago Peninsula Biodiversity Group. I'm mindful too of the Orokonui Sanctuary and the HALO project, and if you don't know what the HALO project is, then I'm sure somebody better than I can explain that to you. But there's some very exciting work going on around our city, and given that we purport to be the wildlife capital of New Zealand, given that our beautiful spaces in our city are what attracts our overseas visitors to visit and domestic visitors to visit our city, and our beautiful parts of our lifestyle that attract people to come and live here and work here. This to me is one of the most important pieces on our papers at the moment. I've been lucky enough to sit on the grant subcommittee that sees the applications come through, and really providing a little bit of seed funding helps. It's not large amounts of money, but it does encourage landowners to do work in terms of clearing gorse or managing pests or whatever. There's an incredible number of volunteers out there too working in this area. That are unseen and really the unsung heroes in our community. So I'll have no trouble whatsoever in supporting this. Thank you.
I'm thrilled to see this go in. In fact, I'm almost disappointed that we weren't given an option for more money. The mover mentioned the conservation, the farmers into conservation. Oddly, through the 2GP, we've had a number of people concerned about the lack of support for the environment and the duties under Section 6 of the RMA that this council has for not only Indigenous flora but also fauna. And what has become quite clear is seeing what plants you've got on your place is very, very easy, but knowing what ecosystems and the biodiversity range with insects and animals and fish is really is much harder to measure. And when we had discussions with farmers who said, look, we're doing this right already, they almost wanted an award system to actually be acknowledged. And we challenged how would we do that. So I think this, and I like the analogy with the heritage, it's certainly one that we've used in questioning people in the 2GP, but I really do want to acknowledge the really good work that has been shown. We've become aware of that there are so many farmers doing this stuff, and it's a real credit to them, but they do want some assistance to understand that, and that's why I'm supporting this. It's been a really good process through the 2GP to engage with the farmers, and I think the staff who've done some really good work in the background, getting the farmers back on side with the project, not seeing it as a hurdle, but actually understanding the process.
I've got nothing further to say, but aside from it's been brought to my attention that this quantum doesn't meet our significance criteria, and so C is somewhat redundant in terms of presenting options for consultation, because we're not. So I'm happy to remove C and remove C entirely, and then vote on that. Would you? Well, I mean, I'll take advice from staff as to whether nothing is better than something in this case.
And so my advice would be that assesses the preferred option is not significant and therefore will not be included in the consultation document.
Okay, thank you. I'll put it by division, please.
But you can't say yes in advance.
So item 30, operating budget option, encouraging private investment in heritage building restoration, page 261. Questions? No questions? Well, if someone would like to move it, Councillor Benson-Pope, you second? Well, I've just had a mover for item option 1. Is there a seconder for that, Councillor Newell? Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think we're all only too aware of the success that we've seen from the Heritage Fund, and the actual grant scheme is only one of the tools in the quiver. I think it's probably true that it's more attractive to people to have that little bit of support than the other options through rating relief or similar. But nonetheless, at best, even at this increased amount, doubled amount, we have only limited capacity to respond to the applications we get. Certainly, as we know, in recent times we've had 2 special ones, and I guess we're going to get them on an ongoing basis, as from the Priory last year, and also more recently First Church. And councillors will recall the work that's been asked for around developing a register of buildings that will fall into those larger categories, public buildings in particular, or probably exclusively. And there's been some discussion outside this forum recently about the potential to develop a targeted rate to meet those commitments down the track, so that the city can, in a different way, support those special iconic buildings that make up so much of the fabric of Dunedin. So that's aside from this. I think councillors will be aware, and perhaps we need to report on a confidential basis more frequently, I acknowledge that, to committees about the way those funds are dispersed. But anyone who's been involved historically in the Heritage Fund will know that it is extremely effective and welcomed by those people who are doing great things in our city, but also underfunded grossly. And I think this is a welcome, option one is a welcome increase to the capacity of the fund, which, remember, doesn't only have Councillor van der Vis and myself sitting on it, but also staff, Dr Johnson, our other advisors, and people from Heritage New Zealand, and gives us the capacity to do all sorts of checking and monitoring of the work that's done that otherwise would not be the case. The key thing is, as one of the developers who got a small grant from the fund two rounds ago, said to me recently that even though it was only a minuscule part of the budget for his project, it was one of the key things that helped it happen. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the value that the small amounts comparatively that we're putting into this area has in displaying our bona fides to those business owners and business developers who are doing so much important, critical work in heritage restoration, preservation, and associated fire safety improvements. So I think this is great. Thank you.
I can't disagree with anything that Councillor Pope has said, but yeah, unusually. But there is, however, I think, a need for a little caution here. The success of the Heritage Fund has been unprecedented, I believe, in terms of the very small amounts of money and the massive investment that, not just the money, but the encouragement, the getting alongside, the making things easier through planning, planning zones, all of those other things that went with it. And I think that the pride that a lot of these building owners have taken in doing it themselves and being facilitated by the DCC has been an almost ideal arrangement. I am not sure that by substantially increasing the amount of grants that we give, that we are going to actually get a much better result. I think that if we were to have a modest increase in the grant, which is why I was wanting to propose option 2, that obviously it doesn't put so much pressure on our highly pressured finances, but B, it still puts us in the role essentially of focusing on encouraging, facilitating, and not us actually doing it. When we get to the stage with Heritage where the DCC itself is actually substantially financing heritage upgrades, earthquake treatment, whatever, if we get to that point, then I think there's the risk that developers may look slightly differently at the fund and see it as perhaps a soft touch, a reason to not provide the funds themselves, but see what they can get out of the DCC in the first instance. So much as all I've enjoyed being on this committee, and for many years in different roles now, I've seen it grow. I've seen the number of applications grow. I've seen the size of those applications increase, and I do have a bit of worry that we are going to get to a point where we are actually going to be funding the work itself rather than encouraging, facilitating, and giving a kind of seed funding. So although I won't be incredibly unhappy if option 1 goes through, I think that it would be more prudent for us to go for option 2. I don't want to harp on about consultation because I don't think that the community feedback is going to be really relevant. But the way the fund is seen, if we go for option 2, I think is something which would have our longer term image of the fund more appropriate than if we start really ramping up the amounts that we start giving to applicants. Thank you.
I have great comfort that Councillor Vandervis, in his role on that committee, will not let what he just suggested happen because the rules preclude it, in that the share of the money usually has to be considerably more from the developer, and I'm sure that he wouldn't let money go out that didn't meet those requirements. I'm delighted to support this. I think there's some really, really big cases that will come up shortly. I think the earthquake-prone buildings work has barely touched the on a lot of residential and other structures like churches, and the vulnerability some of those buildings are at. And I have no doubt that the role that the work that's already happened will actually need to increase as the earthquake rules come into effect. And I have had the pleasure of sitting through the 2GP and hearing still the vulnerability of some of our heritage buildings, and how important some of those are to the residents of the city, and that doesn't have any bearing on what we're going to, the decision making. It's just the passion that people have of the city for the heritage. And so I think that we need to ensure that the money is there for those things to happen that the city ratepayers want to happen. So I'm very heartened to see this opportunity come before us.
For my part, I support this. I think that we will find an increasing need for this fund for a couple of reasons. One is the increased demand, or the increased standards, for instance, for earthquake strengthening required by the government. And the second is the buildings that they will apply to. Councillor Wilson has mentioned those residential buildings, but more importantly, pseudo or semi-public buildings like churches. And these are not owned by developers. There's no ability to make a profit off them. But they remain, even though their congregations in many cases are diminishing, their value to the community as heritage, the heritage value to the community isn't diminished. And I think that the community at large will increasingly see it as its responsibility, because it's no one else's, to help with the preservation of those buildings. So I don't think the demand for this is going to go down at all. In fact, I think it's going to go up, and I think that we may face in the future some really some quite large demands, and there'll be some quite tricky decisions, because no one will want to see, you know, we might have preserved First Church, but then there's Knox, and then there's the cathedral, and a number of buildings that it would be absolutely tragic to lose. I think this community will realise its responsibility to step up and preserve those for posterity. So I think this is, I think this increase is very timely, and I would suggest that it may increase into the future. Any further speakers? Ranan, do you wish to speak? Yes. Right. Councillor Elder.
Just a question, actually, just about approves preferred option. I note that Serenitis on the other day just tabled that they would like all options when consultation came forward, and I don't know whether that that applies to this or not, but I do know that that community board was saying that they would like options when we consulted. That was I don't know whether it applies to this or not.
Look, it's your call. You can add this in to be consulted on if you want to. The issue is it doesn't hit the significance threshold because of the size, so you don't have to. But if you want to add it in, you can.
Yeah, I was just not sure about that.
Thank you.
Well, just a couple of comments I'd like to make, then I'll come back to that question. I think Councillor Vandervis is wrong. This isn't an increase in the amount of grant money we give. This is an increase in the funds available to be considered for disbursement. And I can confirm what Councillor Wilson alluded to a moment ago, that these, any applications, and quite a variety of applications, and in a new area more recently in terms of some of the archaeological discoveries on the peninsula, which was previously uncharted territory. All grants are very strongly scrutinised, and we don't hand out money because we have it. We hand out a support of whatever kind at the level that the collective group considers appropriate for that grant. So I don't think, I know given how grossly oversubscribed the fund is, this is not going to lead to any profligacy. My response to the immediately previous question about whether we should consult on this or not, I don't think that's necessary given the huge support we've had for the fund, the difficulties we have, which I acknowledge we don't report as well as we should, and I'll fix that sooner rather than later. It will have to be in confidence, of course, because you'll have to see what was applied for and what people get, and the numbers are very different. Things like First Church and the Priory are in a class of their own, clearly. So it'd be important for people to understand that. But given the support when this was first consulted 3 annual plans ago, 3 long-term plans ago, 2 long-term plans ago, I think, and their subscription and the feedback from the recipients, I don't think there's any need to put this in the super sensitive, significant, we need to consult, because I know how strongly this money, this funding is supported by our community.
I'm going to put it. This is option 1. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Are there any abstentions? No. Thank you. Carried. Right. Item 31. Operating budget option, investing in place-based community groups, page 271. Right, do you wish to introduce this one, or just straight into questions?
Happy to go straight to questions.
Nothing at this point, just to say I'll move option 1.
Right, so we've got a second.
Just as it relates to these groups, as it relates to community boards, are we supporting this because these regions are having difficulty forming community boards, or do we feel that they offer a different service? And if so, what do we know about how the makeup of these community groups are made up in terms of representation of their community?
Sorry, can we just break those down into?
Okay, the first question is, are these fulfilling de facto roles of community boards, because there is no community board in that area?
Yes, to some extent, and most of the place-based communities are in non-community board areas. Although there are some, as referenced in the report, like the Green Island overlaps. Greater Network, the Mosgiel, there is a Mosgiel community group as well, and there's one in Waikuiti, for example. So there are groups who are currently within community board areas, and there are groups outside of community board areas as well. And so part of this is to say, how do we support all place-based groups across the community in a potentially more equitable way?
And then the next question is, as they represent place-based community groups, how do we assess the makeup of those groups and how they are how do we know the relationship between their community and their ability to represent their community?
Yeah. So that varies currently, and we know that that varies in terms of establishing a separate grant pool for that. We would be setting some criteria, not onerous, but that the community has to show potentially every 3 years how they've engaged with their community, so that we can be sure that they are representing their community. A challenge, I think, will be, as we go forward, how interest groups and there are smaller place-based groups within communities and then larger groups, so it will be discussion with those groups around how they can better connect and collaborate to achieve outcomes for their whole community. So some of that's not going to be done without good discussion in the next wee while.
Great, thank you.
Further questions?
Sorry. So, so they represent a voice for their community. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I mean, we've identified 16 groups in here. As we know, there are other groups too, that are out there who would say they're place-based. Some in a group of streets who would say they represent a group of streets in our community, and some who would say they represent wider communities. And that's the need to get communities within communities to hopefully work together more collaboratively. Thank you.
Thank you. Joy, we look on page 273, paragraph 15, or actually other funding sources. What funding sources are these groups currently tapping into?
So we are one of the predominant funders. Obviously, a number of them do their own fundraising. Many groups do get COGS funding through DIA and through lotteries as well, for quite small amounts, usually a few $1,000s. Some groups are also applying to Otago Community Trust for resources such as newsletters. So Otago Community Trust, for example, doesn't provide operational funding for salaries or overheads, which our grant funding does allow, but it can support events, particular projects or newsletters. So there is a range of funding out there. We do also point some of those groups who talk to us about other funding through the Generosity database, which has thousands of funding avenues on it as well, but we are quite a significant funder for place-based groups.
Okay. Just for clarification, this is a $200,000 fund that's being suggested. Is there a cap on how much one group could maximise?
We haven't gone to the detail of that. We do recognise that the grant fund would have to probably have two sets of criteria, one for smaller groups who are predominantly volunteer and looking for project money. That's probably somewhere around the 5,000 or less, and other groups who are more formalised, who have overhead costs that are higher, which we'd look to probably cap at 30 to 40, and we'd want the grants subcommittee to provide some advice and be involved in that decision with us if this progresses.
And what would your definition be of place groups?
Mine is they are groups that represent a geographical community of interest and take a broad approach to the well-being of that community from a social, economic, environmental, recreational perspective and cultural perspective. So they aren't specifically driven by one of those. They're actually looking at all of it in terms of whole of community well-being for a particular geographical area.
So would you look at something like the Bloke Shed being seen as, and there's various ones of them around the city, being seen as a place-based organisation?
I think what we'd say is they're probably one of the groups I've talked about earlier. That's a smaller place-based group within a wider place-based geographical location, and that's the complexity of this, is that there are wider groups that would say we're representing our community. What we need to go back and ensure is happening is their connection to those smaller groups within the community. The Bloke Shed, as an example, may be considered more of an interest group within a place-based geographical location.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is a question, really. As I said, I do want to see an increase in our social spending, and I'm just seeking clarification initially. When we talk about the current $200,000 for community grant funding, does that include the service level, the grants, city service grants?
No. So the community grants referenced in here are just our community grants that are usually under $10,000 and really sit around about the $4,000 in terms of what's granted per organisation. City Service City project is over that, and is, gosh, off the top of my head, about $460,000 per year. So that's more for peak body organisations within the city who have a city-wide approach.
So I'm just aware again of community consultation with tangata whenua at Araitiuru Marae, and it was very much expressed in terms of puaka matariki being considered on that level, or increased funding. Where do we put that into the equation?
So puaka matariki, we made a request through our operational budget, which you approved yesterday, for some additional funding for puaka matariki going forward, of $20,000 additional per year at this point.
So what does that bring them up to?
It brings it up to $58,500 for that one festival per year, which we contribute to. So.
Okay, and that doesn't include salary, or it does?
No. Well, it doesn't include our staff time and our staff resource and any of the resources that council delivers alongside that in terms of promotion of puaka matariki or other things that we do in kind. It's our budget, and then traditionally we do receive some funding from Otago Community Trust for that festival, which supports the wānanga events that are held throughout the city as well.
Okay, thank you. So, given that I personally am in touch with a lot of those community-based groups, and that they've arisen over a decade or so, and especially following up on the foundational work done by Dunedin community builders. So I believe I'm aware of some of the needs of those place-based community groups, and I would say that criteria, in terms of funding criteria, whether the groups are small or large, it should be based on need. It's not on the number of volunteers or how big the organisation is. There's actually need in the community, and I'm thinking especially of course Thorfinn and Brockfall and other groups, and Pine Hill as well. So I would, I don't know if this is the right procedure or forum, but I would ask the mover if he might think about increasing that to 300k, both on the community-based, place-based communities and the community grant funding.
Yeah, I can present. Yeah, that's what I'll do. And I think they're different issues, so I wouldn't want to conflate them. But I'm happy to amend it to be included in the consultation document. We'll put to stick with 200k in the budget, but consult on a 300,000 option. That's fine. If Councillor Newell is comfortable with that, it's happy by me. Yeah. Thanks. Which means we'll need to amend C. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Hill.
I believe one of the reasons that we are funding these or proposing fundings is that the Department of Internal Affairs has ceased to fund substantially some of the place-based groups, and I was just wondering, just about that. I have another question related to that.
Yes, there was some substantial funding from the Department of Internal Affairs to 3 of those groups over the last few years, and that funding pool has now ended. Change in central government approach. So we have had increasing requests over the last 2 years for us as local government to look at supporting these place-based groups to try and replace as much of that government funding as possible. I recognise that this budget will not replace the $1 million or so that's gone into some of those organisations, and so it is a lesser fund. Does that answer that? I mean, there is still, as I said, COGS and lottery grants money in very small amounts offered to, available to those groups, but nowhere near what was provided to some of them.
So it's just a concern to me that government's pulling funding. Do you see any change with the new government in this policy at all? I mean, it's quite early to say, and it will take a long time to come into place, but
I'm not aware of any change. I've not heard that there would be a change.
So do we need to, one of the questions I was asking, do we need to send a message to central government about the fact that they are not funding these groups effectively, because they do have such good outcomes in the community?
Will we be paying any salaries to people in these place-based community groups, or will they be more for operational costs?
Some of it would probably make a contribution to salary. There are a number of these groups that have part-time coordinators.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Just responding, the question around, or the comparison to community boards, I suppose, has been made by Councillor O'Malley, and that's probably worth addressing. We don't have the power to create community boards where none exist. They're a creature of the representation review process that we go through every 6 years, and there's a set of quite specific criteria that the Local Government Commission need to be satisfied with to be able to go ahead with that. Largely these are, which means that largely these are urban community groups with notable overlaps with board areas, as have been mentioned. It is quite amorphous in terms of a definition of what is a place-based group, which is quite awkward language, as bureaucratic language tends to be. But that's such as the nature of our communities, that all look and interact with each other differently. And I think that we need to have the flexibility to be able to support local solutions and local opportunities in a way that is most appropriate to those local areas. And I'd certainly take on board and endorse the comments made by Councillor Lofiso around it being based on need, because there's certainly a spectrum of capacity in those neighbourhoods, and as such a spectrum of capacity in the groups that work with them and support them. And I do hope that there's also flexibility in the criteria that get developed to support this, to allow groups to work together on projects and collaborate on projects as we go through this process. Councillor Lofiso said at the beginning, and has reiterated the point through the course of this meeting, that her comfort with supporting significant capital projects and the attendant rates rises is in some degree dependent on the support that this council shows for social investment at the same time. And when I saw the agenda for this meeting, I was a little concerned that all of our operational budget papers were at the end after we'd got all the significant capital projects out of the way, because were all of these to fail to get support, I would find it hard to justify going back and justify the significant capital spend that we have planned over the next 10 years. So much of what we want to achieve and deliver as a city will be better achieved and delivered with the support of our communities if we empower them to help us do that. Absolutely everything, whether that's, I mean, we talk about it most often in a social well-being framework, which is a bit paternalistic and patronising if you ask me, but it's also about economic development, environmental sustainability, resilience, civil defence, arts and culture, everything that we are trying to achieve will be achieved more efficiently and more effectively if we empower our neighbourhoods and our community groups to help us do that. And it is to us, I mean, yeah, there are far more thorough ways of doing this and far more revolutionary approaches to doing this, but they take time to develop. I think it's important to note that this is an interim measure, really, so that we can allow some work to be done with these groups while we work with them to develop a longer term option. And I would love for the Department of Internal Affairs to be involved with that. I think that would be entirely appropriate in the Otago Community Trust and any number of other significant funders who can, should be involved in supporting the well-being of our communities. And I mean, just lastly, this, to some degree, the discussion that the previous council had that got us to the point of further resourcing the community development team was about parity. It did come out of the conversation we had through the representation review, where, you know, people in my neighbourhood are lucky because they have the support of council as a whole, but also the support of a community board and staff time and energy in addressing the needs of those communities, and that is not something that is afforded to our urban communities, and the previous council acknowledged that and went a small way towards trying to redress that. And this is another step in the direction to get us to, hopefully, a more holistic, structural approach that will come to the next council's long-term plan process in 3 years. So, and I thank the councillor for the suggestion that we put it out to people and see how much they are prepared to invest in this very noble work, and I look forward to the conversation that we will no doubt have with those groups in February through May, when we eventually decide on the budget for the next 10 years. Thanks.
As I've been listening to the questions on this, I'm reminded of the Maori proverb, what is the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is people, it is the people, it is the people. And I was totally wrong when I said that the last item that I was here for around biodiversity was the most important item on our agenda. This actually is, because it does involve people. I've seen the worth of money being spent. It doesn't always have to be large amounts of money, in terms of communities through community boards and the seed funding and so forth. And I know it's a different structure, and I just want to clarify that two things. One is that communities can decide and appeal to the possibility of having a community board in their community, and there are such things as urban community boards. And I also just wanted to clarify that Internal Affairs hasn't pulled the funding there. I think it's different to ending the funding. It was always going to be for a set period of time, and that time has come to an end, regrettable as that is. And I know that a lot of these place-based groups struggle having to apply for funding every year. That's difficult when they don't have that certainty sort of 3 years out. So I've seen that small amounts of money can go a heck of a long way in communities, and I really do believe that we benefit as a city from strong, vibrant communities, and as Councillor Hawkins says, coming up with local solutions and local opportunities. That's where the exciting stuff happens in our city. So I'm really pleased that Councillor Lefiso has come up with C. I can support that as well. I think that's a really good thing to go out into the community and ask. and I would anticipate that we'll get a very positive response to that. So I'll be supporting it.
My main objection to putting funding into place-based communities is that because we are now connected far more than we ever have been in the past by the internet, by the phone, that communities within Dunedin are increasingly no longer place-based. If you look at the various clubs, the various organisations that are growing, and you look at the communities which are just place-based, it's the sports clubs, it's the people that are connected via Facebook, it's the people that have their own communities of interest now these days that are increasingly not place-based. So that the argument that we're somehow creating parity by funding areas that don't have a community board, for instance, or seem not to have councillor representation, I believe are really very weak ones. The funding going often to basically pay wages for facilitators is funding which my previous experience of community grants shows to be funding that has been, in the past anyway, money poorly spent. I'm thinking of the particular example in North East Valley where we put $5,000 into a essentially place-based garden situation, which was vaunted as one of the most successful projects around that particular community grant. And for $5,000, we got the most expensive 1 year of lettuces and cabbages in a small plot that you could ever hope for, and a shed that had basically a lot of unused implements in it. I'm not convinced that the return for this kind of investment is a return that is really that positive, whereas I applaud the idea of communities in certain areas being recognised by us. I think that in an internet age, the place-based communities are becoming relatively irrelevant, and that the real communities of interest spread right across the city and should be identified in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to acknowledge Councillor Hawkins and Councillor Gary for acknowledging that this is a small step towards what we're doing, and I acknowledge also my level of emotion given the sorry. Given that not too long ago my brother passed away, and he worked, and I acknowledge that other city council staff work hard, but he worked very hard in terms of making connections with those people and those residents and our people in community, place-based communities. So I just want to acknowledge Michael. Secondly, I acknowledge Councillor Gary, that whakatauki just triggered off a lot of emotion for me. And when I spoke yesterday and I talked about people in hardship, and I acknowledge Councillor Steadman for speaking to me during afternoon tea time and talking about the excitement that the bridge can bring and the use of our use by our residents of the bridge and other places. I said to him, thank you for that. But I have been spoken to by people who cannot afford the bus fare to get to town. They don't have vehicles. They don't have they don't have computers or internet access. So I'm also speaking as a person who worked as a coordinator of a place-based community project. And from my experience, I believe that every neighbourhood, whether it's Māori Hill or Portobello or Brockville, every neighbourhood should have a place-based worker. And that's an investment in our people. There is so much hardship going on in those place-based communities that I just acknowledge councillors who will support this.
It's interesting. I note that a number of community boards came to the council on yesterday, and because they have a community board, because they kind of have a place-based group, they have a chance to be able to communicate with their communities and put forward their own vision for their own area. And I believe that is the benefit of having maybe an advisory board or a place-based group or a community board. In a sense, that sense of place is actually really important. And we have in Dunedin some distinct geographical areas. And I note that in the Dunedin City Council resident satisfaction survey, that North East Valley actually had a higher satisfaction level, and I think maybe that's something to do with having a whole of community approach to things. So I disagree on that point in the sense that, you know, we've got quite isolated geographical areas like Pine Hill, like Brockville, like Corstorphine, who don't have access to that kind of support to put forward their own hopes and dreams. And yeah, so I just want to make Awhi Marie on that.
I will obviously support this. My questions that proceeded into this relate to structural questions, and it simply comes down to we are going to have to obviously take the word of any of these groups that they are in fact representative of their communities, because we don't have necessarily any other mechanism of assessing that. And in doing that, most will be, but then some won't be. And I'm concerned about the effects of actually the ones that are not, where someone has come forward and says, my group represents, and they've got some nice photos of people saying we represent this community. And yet that community, if it was polled, may actually say that group is not actually that representative, and we don't really have a mechanism of assessing that, which is why I brought up the community board concept, because I know it's a clunky concept, and in some respects it doesn't work, but in other respects it is at least subject to the rigours of appointing a new group every 3 years on a triennium. So all I'm saying at this point is I want to be sure that when we do this, that the oversight reflects the fact that we are in fact getting community representative groups. I think they offer, I like the flexibility of them. I like the fact that we aren't necessarily formally having to go through the community board process, but I am conscious of the fact that there are some out there, potentially maybe even on this list now, that their communities themselves may consider this as contentious. And I'll give you an example of one that probably wouldn't be on the list, is the South Dunedin Action Group. And could they? They would maybe internally say that they feel they do represent their community. So who's on and who's off this list, I think, is where this can be a problematic environment, and I would say that that's where a major level of oversight needs to exist. And I would also like us to consider adding urban community boards to our community board list in the future. Thank you.
You know, I look back on the minutes from previous meetings where I abstained based on the community board area. But through the year, the place-based groups have really and continue to punch above the weight, and the impact they make throughout the community just gets stronger and stronger. I do struggle with, similar to what Councillor O'Malley's just said, that this may open the door for other groups or organisations or meeting of people to sort of say, oh, well, we'll form our own place-based group. But in some cases, we don't want to have a proliferation of them all over the community. We want to have strong, effective ones, and I think that's the important part that I would really, it's a case we want to fund something that, in what we've seen in the past from the groups we currently have, is the return to the community is dramatic. They really do make a difference. And I think, for essentially the $200,000 per year, potentially 3 that we're going out for consultation, the return of investment is dramatic in my opinion, and I will be supporting this.
Well, I think in looking at this, what comes to mind for me is the realisation that where councils can make the most contribution, the most valuable contribution in their community, is not in just providing core services or sewage or water. We should do that, and we do that, and our communities have an expectation that that's what we'll provide, and we'll provide it efficiently and effectively. That's what we should do. It's taken for granted. That's what councils do. However, where we provide, I think, the opportunity for the most value is in placemaking. And that placemaking can be expressed, our efforts in that regard as councils can be expressed in a number of ways. It might be through developing strategies, overarching strategies as we have. It might be in helping to create a vision along with other people. It might be working together with various stakeholder groups in the community. What is common to all of those is that we can't do it on our own. Councils can facilitate placemaking in all sorts of ways, but we can't do it on our own. And that's where place-based groups come into it. And I agree to some extent with Councillor Vandervis that in the contemporary age there are a lot of different groups that are connected different ways. But it's not an either-or. There's those groups, but there are still place-based groups. And we've heard around the table that some of them can be quite isolated to their place, actually, quite restricted to it. And I accept that, and Councillor O'Malley raised a very good point, that distinguishing the genuine ones that are effective from the also-rans, it will be a challenge sometimes. But I just go back to the biblical injunction, by their fruits ye shall know them. And you look at them, and what they produce will tell you what their outcomes are, you'll know whether they're any good. And the 2 that have recently come to see us in public forum, the Green Island Group and the Valley Project, are 2 real exemplars. And Councillor Vandervis, you need to get up to that garden, because you're quite wrong about that garden. I have an ongoing interaction with that garden up there, the community garden in North East Valley, and it is absolutely splendid and very, very active. So it was certainly not a waste of money. I interact with it on an ongoing basis. So I'm very supportive of this. I think that it's a good and very modest, but a good investment in our community. And it's a bit like the seed funding we talked about with the environment, with the previous item, and with heritage. It's actually not a lot of money considering what it engenders and what it facilitates and what it supports in terms of resource and effort coming from the community.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I want to acknowledge a representative from the Community Board Executive Committee. There certainly is capacity for if a community decides that this is the most appropriate way for them to be supported within a governance structure, as the Peninsula did. that certainly is an option, but these are largely groups that have grown up in a vacuum where such a thing didn't exist, and I think kind of retrofitting it to suit a more bureaucratic model isn't always going to be the most appropriate. And I know in Christchurch, for example, there are urban community boards right across the city, but they were like that from the beginning, and so it's a less awkward solution. I take on board the questions around legitimacy and mandate and all those sorts of things, and they're hard questions, and I think to some degree you just have to have a degree of trust in people that in the work that they're doing. I don't think we're going to be inundated by new groups springing up for the sake of $200,000 or maybe $300,000 in a contestable fund, because this is really hard work. As anybody who's been involved with any of these groups can attest, people don't do it for fun. They do it because there's a need in their community to do it, and no one else is doing it usually. And this is just a small contribution from us to assist them in that. Yeah, and the argument that we shouldn't be funding neighbourhood groups or place-based groups and should be focusing on things like sports clubs and other organisations, well, we do all of that through our various funding streams. They're not mutually exclusive. The idea that we should give up on face-to-face communication in the digital age, and that it's more important that we have online communities are more important, is just nonsense. Although I do acknowledge those in the room who have lost the what-if community in which to dwell recently. There's more to life than Facebook, believe it or not, whether we're getting official feedback on council's 10-year plan or neighbourhoods organising themselves to meet their needs and strengthen their quality of life. We have to invest in people and face-to-face communication if we're to make any meaningful difference, I think. And this is, as I say again, an interim measure to help support the work that's already happening, while we figure out what better structural, medium or long-term solutions might look like and what would be required to make that happen. So I'm heartened by the support around the table, and again, thoroughly commend the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No. Recorded, please. Thank you. That's carried. And with we've arrived at 12:30. I understand that lunch was delivered at 12:30. So we will adjourn. I'll move from the chair. Second council stays. We'll be back here at 1 o'clock. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Right, councillors, we'll get underway again. We're on to item 32, page 279, the 10-year plan, third round of supporting documents. And you don't look like Sandy. Yep, that's probably a good thing. Right. Gavin, do you want to introduce it, or perhaps you could just explain? I've just checked. Where it says shown or amended, any amendment, mostly we went with the recommendations, but where we went feral and departed from them, it'll be recorded in the previous minutes. So my understanding is we don't have to take that out and restate it. It'll be as recorded in the minutes if we have amended a recommendation, unless anyone wants to revisit them in light of the later ones. But that's so. Gavin, would you like to?
So just a couple of things for the councillors. So if we refer back to item 5, which was the Chief's report, we have the draft financial statements for the 14 years. So that includes an income statement, a balance sheet, cash flow. The asset report that was in the original papers did have some date issues at the top of the thing. That was a little test. So there was another page reissued yesterday. So if you haven't got that, just give us a yell and we'll... No, that's the supplementary one. So what we've done is we've taken the draft budget for 2018-19 and then blown that out across the balance of years 2 to 10. Obviously, we've had to factor in the budgeted capital program in terms of the implication that has on the operations, and also we've taken into account the fact that as part of the strategy we will be required to sell some assets, so obviously we've had to reflect that in the draft budgets as well. So the rate increases range from obviously the 6.9 in the first year, from 5 then down to, I think it goes down to 4 in year 10, but obviously that's prior to any decisions that you as councillors have made in the last few days. So I'm happy to take questions. My primary focus will be the financial statements and then the finance strategy.
So just to reiterate, councillors, the top line of the motion, that we're approving this, like everything else, for the purposes of public consultation. So this is included in that, it's not separate. Right, question.
Can you please explain to me what possible rationale there could be for selling properties that give us a return, that give us a reasonable return on investment and are gaining in capital gain, in order to spend that money on items that will give us no return but cost us a lot in ongoing maintenance forever, in the context of a debt ceiling that we are far too close to? Sorry.
So, Council, as part of the earlier discussions in the workshops, we talked about debt ceilings, etc. So, through a number of discussions over the recent months, we've come to a debt ceiling of 285. That 285 is based on a 2014-15 peak that was in the last LTP of 255, inflation adjusted to 2019-20. So, in order to deliver the capital program, and if I refer councillors to page 289, prior to any asset sales, you will note that in 2023, or 2024 actually, we will breach the self-imposed 285 limit, or the limit that we've put in the finance strategy. So in order to keep that debt below the 285, we have had to factor in some sales of assets. So this is in order to deliver the program that you as councillors have confirmed you want to consult on, and what you want to put in the 10-year plan. So all we're saying is in order to deliver that and maintain the 285 debt limit, you will need to make a conscious decision to sell something.
Yes, my question is, why would we be selling assets that are revaluing and giving us a return when we have other assets, Aurora in particular, for which we will not be getting a return and which quite conceivably won't be increasing in value with all the money we're pouring into them? Why would we sell returning assets and keep non-returning liabilities like Aurora?
So in terms of the assets that we can sell or want to sell, that is really a decision for you as elected members. All we've done is at this stage has said in order to deliver the 285, or live within the 285 limit, you will need to sell something. What that looks like at the point that we need to do that is a decision for you guys.
My second question is, given that this forecast is going to breach already in 2023, what happens if the council actually wants to do something significant in the way of perhaps moving part of the bridge to accommodate the harbour basin development? What then happens if future councils actually want to spend significant money?
So again, that would be then looking at the priorities in terms of what's left in the program, and obviously different priorities that are coming forward from maybe a new council. So again, that's your decision to make. At the end of the day, you can also look at lifting the debt ceiling. I mean, the debt ceiling is based on a calculation, and we've flatlined it for the full 10 years. Normally when you do a debt calculation, if you look at the ratios that LGFA use and Standard & Poor's, they talk about it relative to income. So obviously as your income goes up, theoretically you could raise the debt limit. So you have a number of mechanisms available. It really just depends on what you want to do and what you want to achieve.
Thank you.
Gavin, can I just follow up on Councillor Van Evers's question? I take it that in looking at the assets that we might sell, Councillor Van Evers quite rightly mentioned that the assets might show a return, but would it be appropriate to compare the return with what debt costs? So, in other words, if debt costs us 6% and the return of the asset was 10%, you might be better to hang on to the asset and pay more out in debt. On the other hand, which is unrealised, on the other hand, if the return on the asset is 4% and debt's costing you 6, then why wouldn't you consider it?
Yeah, so that's correct. So I mean, at the end of the day, currently we're looking based on the current what's in the budget. Obviously, we've had some discussions in the last couple of days that has increased that capital budget, but at this stage, we're actually not going to breach that until 2023. So there's a fair bit of time for us to review what we own, what's not performing, or what we think is appropriate to sell. So it's not like you have to make an imminent decision today to sell something. There is time to allow you to make that decision. But obviously, you are right. I mean, you'd want to look at what your lowest performing assets were, and maybe sell those first. And it's in a debate about what that means.
I'm not entirely sure who this question is for, but I just want to go back to basics, because I mentioned this the other day, that I found it really helpful when the Chief Executive came along to our community board at the time and explained that we were in the lowest quartile of rates, and I can't remember, and the other comment she made at the time was, I could pay off all the debt if I sold all our assets. I could pay it all off by Christmas. And it kind of put it in perspective for our community, which was really helpful. I think there's people out there in our community who see us having any debt as being a problem, and I know that's not the case. In fact, there's an expectation as a council that we will have debt. And I wanted to ask, perhaps it's the Mayor I asked this of, how does central government view it? If we go along to ask for funding for major project of some kind or infrastructure of some kind, which we may be about to do, and if we had very little debt or no debt, how would that be perceived? And how is it viewed in local government New Zealand?
I can only comment on the feedback that has been given to me by some people in central government and by some people in some councils. So where there's a proposal, for instance, for central government to contribute to a council, where there's a need, and the context for this is that we have identified that our very narrow funding base for local government, which is pretty much property taxes, is too narrow. It's not sustainable. And so there's more and more inclination to go to central government and ask for help with things like tourism infrastructure or regional development infrastructure or whatever. And in some cases, there's an inclination to go to central government and say, look, we've got a population of 15,000 people, we need a $40 million waste plant, we have to replace it. How are we going to do that? Can we have some help? And the reaction from central government, or the potential reaction, because I'm not stating any specific actual case, but the commentary that you get back is, well, you demonstrate your need, and then they say, what's your balance sheet look like? And say, well, we've got no debt. They say, well, this is an intergenerational asset. You need to leverage your balance sheet. You need to take on a bit of debt, at least some, because there's several generations going to be paying for this, and it's not reasonable to expect your current generation alone or someone else, i.e. central government, to contribute to this if you're not prepared to spread the cost. And the interesting thing is that the reaction from some other councils when, for instance, local government New Zealand might go into bat for councils in general seeking help from central government is some councils say, well, it would be unfair if the councils that had rated reasonably high and gone into debt in order to pay for essential assets didn't need assistance and didn't get it, and yet other councils who weren't prepared to leverage their balance sheets and weren't prepared to put the rates up a bit got a free handout. So that's the response or the reaction and in the current climate.
So it would be fair to say there's an expectation that as a council we will have a certain level of debt, and that would be an expectation that's perfectly reasonable.
That's my understanding, just as most people would appreciate that most of us need a mortgage to buy a house.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Just a question, if I may, about Your Worship, about this sort of very broad term asset that's been used. My understanding is that there's no suggestion that we should sell any important strategic assets, and the fact what we're talking about is poorly performing property that we own in various parts of the country. Is that the correct situation?
Again, that's what we built into the budget, but again, at the time we make those asset sales, that will be decided by you as elected members.
And while people will know my resistance to sale of those major assets that our forebears developed for us, there is a difference, and this authority has been repeatedly critical of other organisations nearby for their investment in other than in Dunedin, and I think there's a very strong message in that for us in terms of where we have property holdings. You know, I'm not against there being a Bunnings shop in Pororua, but I don't see why we should own it if we can get a good price for it, actually.
Craig, ask Gavin. My perception is that should we come to that time when we need to look at those assets and go, do we want to sell or do we want to hold, there would be an analysis done, and there'll be some figures around the cost benefit on each decision, and at that point we can make that decision. We're not making it now.
That's correct, Councillor.
So you would do an analysis, a sheet, and we could all look at it and go, hey, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense.
Correct.
Councillor Watt.
Gavin, it looks like we're really good at spending money. How can we go about increasing revenue? So obviously increasing rates is one way. What other options do we have on increasing revenue?
If we just go across to, I'm just trying to think of what page it is. We've got some pie charts which shows where the revenue comes from. So if we go across to page 293, it shows our source of the funds. So it does show that at this stage the major source of funds is rates, and probably primarily will be. Then you obviously have your external revenue coming from our various trading operations or operations such as the poll, etc. And then obviously we have our government grants. So certainly the government grants is an area where Transport obviously focused to maximise, you know, our entitlement in that area. In terms of other things, we can look at what other things we can charge for, but obviously you get to a price point within the community in terms of their ability to absorb that. So again, that would have to be a conscious decision of council to shift from maybe a rating to a more user pays, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of solid waste yesterday, actually going the other way. So it really comes down to the appetite of moving that burden from one, because effectively it's the same community gives the money, it's just how you distribute that spread.
Okay. Or looking at other rating options, I guess, would be the other.
Correct, but you're still rating from the same community, but it might be where the load sits.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I have no interest in pursuing the sale of our companies, but I do have a question, Mr. Logie, for the benefit of those who do support that. What effect do you think would constantly and publicly running down the competence and performance of those companies have on what you would realise in trying to sell them?
So I believe DCHL are currently getting a valuation done from Murray & Co. So we will be able to compare that to the valuation done 18 months ago, and it'll be interesting to see the impact of recent events in terms of the valuation. But certainly Yeah, you're correct. I mean, at the end of the day, the value is based on a number of factors, including obviously returns in that, but obviously any publicity around those companies. So obviously what happened in December last year would not have had a positive impact on the valuation of one of our companies. But it'll be interesting to see what that looks like when we get the Marenco valuation and where that currently sits.
Thank you.
Right, there are none. Would someone like to move the resolutions? Councillor Vincent Pope. Second, Councillor Staines. You like to speak? Okay, any further speakers? Councillor.
These recommendations set us up for a level of vulnerability to interest rate rises that is unprecedented in our history. The sale of hard assets simply because they are not in Dunedin and they're up north somewhere is, in my view, simple, unbusinesslike, foolish parochialism. The money that an asset generates, whether it generates it in Wellington, Hamilton or Dunedin, is the same money. The return on assets that are up north has traditionally been quite a lot better, especially when capital gains are considered. And one of the reasons so much Otago money has been invested in Auckland for a very long time now is not because the actual percentage returns year on year are any better, but because the capital gains are spectacularly much more valuable. If we, as is proposed in this paperwork, go ahead and sell positively returning assets and sell them simply because they are not in Dunedin, that is a fundamentally flawed argument, and the real flaw of it comes when you recognise where capital gain arises and not just returns. The fact that we intend swapping massive millions of dollars worth of property, which is not only giving us a direct financial return, but also giving us a capital gain. And we are swapping that in this proposal for doing up essentially prettiness in our own hometown, raising levels of service here that are not going to give us any return at all, and in fact are going to cost us significantly increased maintenance over time, as happens when you raise service levels. You then have a double-edged disaster. You are losing dramatically on the sale end of things, and you are losing again on what you have spent that money on the purchasing end of things. If we go ahead and tick off these recommendations, we are effectively exposing ourselves to potentially ruinous changes in interest rates. Overseas, there has been a significant amount of financial wobble, nothing like 2008 yet, but if you read widely, you will see that a correction is due. The correction has been overdue, in fact, since 2008, and no amount of printing money or burying debt is going to change the fact that a correction is coming. That correction invariably is going to involve a real shortage of cash in some areas, high interest rates, and if we were only to get 1 or 2% increase in interest rates, I believe that would be catastrophic for a city already so indebted, especially since we continue to carry the liability of the enormously indebted Aurora Delta companies. Making this recommendation now, although we've been told that we won't reach a ceiling which can be moved anyway till 2023, making this recommendation now hamstrings all future spending and all future councils, and making it in a way that is only allowed by flogging off positively returning assets is, quite frankly, the most worrying thing I have seen on council since the stadium. There is a very simple book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which explains the fundamentals of what has value and what doesn't. In it, an asset is defined as something that puts money in your pocket. A liability is something which you have to pay maintenance on. What we are doing here in these recommendations is swapping assets for liabilities. Please vote against.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to acknowledge that, I'd like to thank again Mr. Logie and his department for all this mahi and guidance that you give to us. So I am not a business person, but I just want to say that I firstly believe, and I echo Councillor Gary's quote of that whakatauki. The most valuable asset is people. And as far as I'm concerned, and I don't pretend to have much understanding of all the economics that goes on, of that whole global financial network that we're all locked into, but I just would like to say that the talk of returns on investment and all that economics talk, for me, I just look at triple line accounting, and it's not just economic, but it's also social and ecological, environmental. So for that reason, I'll be supporting the motion.
I had a very similar response to what we've just heard, and it is about the people, and I've got 2 children on holiday in Auckland at the moment, and if I were going to compare them to assets or liabilities, I can promise you that they'd come in the latter, but for the measure of love that I have with them and joy that they give me. And that's the problem, I think, if you continue, as happened in the previous debate about place-based. It doesn't matter that even if the community garden had failed, for example, that was the issue. It's what is learnt in the process and the connections that are made. And those are things that will never come out in a, with all respect, Gavin, a very boring report that you might write about numbers, if it's purely about numbers. And so I have to say that I think the process that you've come to, and I echo thanks to you for putting together a plan that makes sense. Yes, things may change. I was a councillor in 2007 when the world was changing quite rapidly financially, and we changed things as we had to, and that will happen again. So if it does happen, but let's go in with what we know now, and thank you for the hard work you've done and bringing it in within the and looking at ways that we can make this work for the city, using our assets as assets, our liabilities, acknowledging them, and focusing on the getting the best result for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Worship. Personally, I'd rather be positive moving forward. In my industry, I hear the stories of up north currently and what is happening. They are struggling in places. The reason why is people are moving to our region. Dunedin is in a magic space at the moment for growth for its people and its ratepayers. We have a magic opportunity here to actually make a great city for its people. So again, I'd rather be positive. The Story Bridge in Brisbane was built during the Depression in 1935. They started building. Now look at that city. That has got so much going on in it, but they decided that works and things like that, they started building the bridge, and look at the magic space they've got there. And I've been over there recently, don't want to talk about it too much, but I just saw the people walking around, cycling, enjoying the environment, hardly any cars around. It's just a magic space, boats going up and down the canal and things like that. It's just a beautiful spot because of one bridge started building in 1935. So I've got a quote here from a lovely lady. No is easy. Looking for ways to say yes shows courage. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking Mr Logie for all of the work he's done in preparing this. We recruit our staff and hire our staff for their expertise, and I wasn't aware of us having incredible financial experts around the table, particularly, I'm sure we all have a diverse range of skills, but I'm very happy to take the advice of the team that are employed to advise us on these matters. I just want to again articulate, because if you parachuted into our conversation, you could easily think we are making decisions to sell assets now. And it has been stressed, and Mr Logie actually clarified this several times over, that we are not making a decision about selling assets today, or which assets. And it was reiterated that when the time comes for us to make those decisions, we'll be looking at the underperforming ones. Various views have been expressed about which those might be, but that would possibly change further on. I believe that that debt is not a dirty word. We've heard around the expectation that we will have debt. We do have a ceiling on it. Today has been, and the last 2 days, have been about vision and investment in our city. And the word being positive has been mentioned, and I like to think that this council is a half-glass full council, not a half-glass empty council. Obviously, we've got to be responsible, but in this vision, we're being bold and creative. We're investing in our city, its environment, both built and natural, and most importantly, we're investing in our people. And many times lately, I've talked to a lot of people who've moved here from other parts of New Zealand and overseas, and the thing that draws them to our city is the lifestyle. And the decisions that we have made in the last 3 days to go out for consultation on various aspects of our city really lend themselves to that and inform that. And so I am very comfortable to go out to the community to consult on these various aspects. We're going out to consult. We're going out to find out what our community thinks about this. I think we're being responsible. I think we're being bold, and I'm proud to be part of this council with its vision.
I think it's really timely that Brandenburg and Taylor put out an inspiring vision that really was bold, innovative and imaginative, because they've actually set the seeds of a vision for the whole of the city in a way. I think the central city and having a vision for that will be inspiring too. Yes, we will need to work in partnership to make this happen, and in working in partnership we will manage to find savings here and there, make good decisions as we go along. So I believe that that bold, innovative and imaginative seed thought that's out there with the harbour-side vision we should take along with us as we make these decisions.
Councillor White.
I think we're sort of between a rock and a hard place at times with this. First off, we're indicating to the community that we're going to increase rates, and we're going to spend some serious amount of money over the next 10 years. And they're looking at it, what are they going to get out of it? What are they going to get back? And what are we going to do for the city? And the thing that really hits home to me time and time again, and all what we've discussed and looked at over the last 2.5 days, and I go back to item 5, which we discussed first thing early on Monday. Renewals expenditure represents 60% of the proposed 10-year capital budget. So 60% of this is stuff that we need to do. It's not what we want to do. It's not what we think this would be lovely to have. It's what we need to do. And I think that, to me, is where we start. It's what we need to do. Some of it, we can look at some of the other peripheral stuff, and we've voted whichever way we wanted to on the rest of it. And it'll go to consultation. But we can't do nothing. We can't stick with status quo. We can't stick at 3% because we may not pay for it now, but others are going to pay dramatically for it in the future, or we're going to have issues that we're going to be having to chase our tails on later and cost us dramatically more. So I'd rather take a proactive approach and invest in our infrastructure. At the same time, do stuff once and do it right. If we're going to dig up the main street, let's do something with it at the same time. Whether we want to spend 35 million or spend 60 million, but let's not have to revisit these things 3 times. The community are going to come back and tell us what they like. They're going to tell us what they don't like. But I think overall in what we're looking at here and what we're trying to set a vision and tone for the city, I think we're setting it up for a very good next 10 years. We're looking at 1,800 people having moved here in the last 12 months. We've got the dynamics to be even a greater small city. And like others have said, there is a great vision going forward that others that are currently here and may move here, all grow up here, will really get to enjoy. And I think that's the important part for me.
Pretty much to follow up to Councillor Wiley, I mean, if you do a back of the envelope calculation, we're doing 60, 20 and 20 in amenity spend, so close to $100 million. And then we're doing over $600 million in 3 waters and road and transport. So if you just take that ratio, it's around about 85% of it is going to be in stuff that we really don't have any option but to do because we've got to do it. And so that other 15%, when you apply that back over the rates of increase, is only going to give us a 1 to 2% differential over what we're looking at now. So 1%, you know, that's basically a $20 rise on a $2,000 bill. So for that kind of different amount of spending for the year, we're talking about, I know it's not exactly 1% by the way, Gavin, but effectively we're saying we can do something that will make this, that will keep going forward and building on the momentum of what we've already done, or we can do something which basically cements us as just a regional city, because I'm really concerned about the fact that we've got to maintain our fourth main centre status. And I think we need to live up to that, and this is a part of the spend that goes to that. And as a proportion of our total spend, it is not like it's 60% of the total spend. It's around about 12 to 15%. Thank you.
Good speakers. It seems to me, and I've referenced this before, it seems to me that a good deal of this comes down to perceiving the difference between cost and value. And in fact, it's an attitudinal thing in a way. It's whether you look at life through darkened glass, where everything's bleak and nothing's positive, or whether you have slightly rose-coloured spectacles on, try and be a little positive. And two of the bases of, or the premises that this is all built on were around asset sales and debt. And I'd like to reassure everyone that we don't have to sell the assets. As Gavin has said, that decision's going to be in our hands, particularly if, as Councillor Vandervis says, the assets are rising in value. Because the corollary of not selling an asset because it's rising in value is that you don't realise the gain, but you can use the gain as collateral to raise your debt because you've got more value, you've got more asset there. So it's a bit of a moot point really, but the fact is if you've got value assets rising in value, you can use them either way. You choose. So I think I go back to my first premise. What we're looking at here is providing increased value to our community. And whenever you realise value, there is a cost. If we only ever look at cost and only worry about cost, well, no one would do anything. Nobody would spend any money at all. Of course things cost you. Our job is to make sure that we optimise the value we provide for our community from what we spend. That's our responsibility. And I don't think our community is is going to thank us if we let the place stagnate because we're too scared to spend some money because of what might happen, because we happen to be looking at the world through darkened glass. It's not going to help at all. If there are no more speakers, I'll return to...
Thank you, Worship. Just a few comments. I made the statement on Monday that I thought these documents were a cohesive narrative and were very well presented, and I repeat that. Several others have made that comment today. They're accessible and they hang together in a much better way than I've seen in other annual plan or long-term plan documents, and I repeat my congratulations to the people who put it together. My opposition to asset sales per se is well known, both in this forum and elsewhere, but I don't consider looking at the potential benefits, advantages or disadvantages of particular property assets in particular as in that category. We have the undertaking as a result of someone's question earlier that after consultation, once we agree on our final issues or as part of that conversation, we will have, if we decide to go down the path indicated and suggested, we will have a case-by-case cost-benefit analysis of particular proposals. So I'm quite relaxed about putting that alongside other considerations in terms of how we fund things and what we choose to fund or not to fund. But I find it really unhelpful that we have so much hyperbole and sort of pervasive negativism and partial statements, inflammatory statements about the situation we find ourselves in. I don't think that helps with the general feeling in the community, and I don't think it helps us to make good decisions either, because it makes things more difficult. I'm entirely standing alongside those people who want to be positive and want to make sure that we make the city as good as we possibly can. I think the capital projects that we've supported almost unanimously, and in some case without dissent, will make an astonishing contribution to the future of the city, and I think they'll also be very widely welcomed, as we've already seen in some of the media already, by the community, and I look forward to those discussions being as objective and as honest as possible.
I am going to put it, this is the collection from 1 to 5 of resolutions. All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against?
No, please.
Thank you. Sorry? Division has been called for.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Elder. Aye. Councillor Garrett.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Aye. Councillor Hawkins. Aye. Councillor Lafiso. Aye. Councillor Lord. Aye. Councillor Newell. Councillor O'Malley. Aye. Councillor Staines. Aye. Councillor Steedman.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Councillor Wilson. Aye. Your Worship.
Yes.
Carried 14.
Thank you. Right. Now, councillors, we move on to item 33, the last item, as I understand it, on our agenda. It's the 2018-19 rating method. There's a supplementary. Is it not taken into account? Councillors, you'll find this is the detail of this is included in the supplementary agenda that was put out. Welcome, Carolyn. Do you wish to introduce this or just want to be interrogated? Do you go for the interrogation option? Okay then. Questions, Councillor Benson-Pope.
Well, it's a question about procedure, Your Worship. I don't know if it's the advisors or the staff or the Chief Executive will be answering this, but in terms of the 10-year plan, clearly there are some issues, and they're flagged in this report in the short term that, and we've added to them, that are going to be considered by the rates working advisory, whatever it is. I'm assuming that the outcomes of those discussions, which are not available now, obviously, will be factored in on a yearly basis into particular annual plans and change the 10-year plan accordingly as a consequence.
Yep, that's right. I suspect it's unlikely we'll be able to do that by February for the draft, but we may well be able to do it by May for the final. We may be close, but yes, that's exactly right.
But if by any chance any of these decisions or extra asks that have been added to that group were resolved by that time, they could be massaged for the 10-year plan as well.
And further to that, I anticipate that as time goes on, other issues will be directed to the rates funding advisory group, and depending on how quickly the chair can deal with them, then we will get the responses back and we will adjust each annual plan as it comes along. Yep, that's right. Got every confidence in that advisory group. Right.
I foreshadowed a question of you, and I'm intrigued by this, and I'm not necessarily wanting to change it, but the community, the UAG, which, and you've got here, you talk about the 33%, I'm now trying to find my paragraph, the 30% targeted rate maximum, which I know, was that in the last, yeah. I'm just checking on the understanding, because I had understood that the drainage rate wasn't part of the targeted rates because it's not done on a uniform basis, but you're confident that its inclusion in that list is correct?
Correct. We have had advice on that in the past. That so it's paragraph 14. We're at 25% of a 30% limit, and we have to include our community services rate, the curbside rate, and our drainage rate in the fixed charges for that calculation.
Thank you.
Just item 15 about rates rebate. Is there a cap on that, like on the amount or anything like that?
So currently the cap is $610, which is it's mentioned in the last sort of section of that paragraph. So the Department of Internal Affairs do adjust that on a periodic basis. So, but again, it's outside our control. It's something that they fund.
Is there a cap on the number of people who can apply for it?
We're not aware of any. We've never been declined. It's all based on income. So at the end of the day, as long as they're income eligible, then we put the claim through and we're paid. So
that's fantastic. So it's how does that rates rebate actually happen? Like,
so effectively, we get people apply for it through a number of all our service agencies. We process them. So we process around 3,000 to 3,500 a year. And so our job is to facilitate. We effectively act as an agent for the DIA. So effectively, what happens is we'll get a claim. We'll evaluate it based on the information provided, make sure the information is correct, and then on that basis, then we'll put the credit onto the rate account, and then we claim the money back off the government.
So when it comes to affordability and rates going up, if people are finding it a real struggle, they can actually apply for those rates rebates through service
so
NGOs or something?
Effectively, they should be applying for them now. I mean, if they're eligible now, then they should be applying for it, and we certainly encourage people to do that.
So do we advertise that anywhere?
Yeah, it goes out in FYI on a regular basis, so we'll do a number of reminders during the year, particularly as we get towards the end of the year, the rating year, so to make sure that people get their forms in. But certainly we get a big influx. I mean, like say, once the ORC rate, so it's obviously applies across the board in terms of the rates, so we'll get a flood of 2,000 applications in 1 month. So certainly, I think this year we're up to 2,700 already.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Your Worship. Is it still the case, well, my recollection at least, is that above and beyond the DIA scheme or the central government scheme, Council can't initiate its own rates relief program for individuals based on income? Like, were we of a mind to set that at a higher rate? Could we contribute to that ourselves as a method of offsetting?
So we're not aware of an exclusion on that. Right. So certainly it would just be again a guidance from the elected members, and then obviously an appropriate process.
Thanks.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just wanted to turn to paragraphs 30 and 31. Two questions. One is, just remind me who is charged the tourism targeted rate?
So all commercial properties.
And when was the last review done of that rate?
When it was introduced, can't recall. Yeah, about 6 years.
Right, thank you.
On page 5, the first list of percentage changes in the different categories of rates, overall impact 11. Why is it that commercial have been hit considerably harder as a percentage than all the other categories?
Through Your Worship, there are two drivers there. One is the general rate differential effect, and the other is how we rate for drainage. So commercial properties pay an additional rate for drainage based on capital value.
Did you have another one, Councillor?
No, that's fine.
Further questions? Councillor Wilson.
I'm just interested, I'm going to go back to this uniform manual charge, and I'm just wondering if you've got any... We only put it up by 1.5, which I get that because it's the LGI, but it doesn't necessarily reflect only matters that are in that index, or am I incorrect there? Because I'm wondering why it's not put up by the average rate increase as well.
Through Your Worship, that is a council decision, so we have over the last few years increased it by the LGCI, but it could be increased at a higher rate than that, up until that 30% limit.
And that in some ways exacerbates exactly the question that Councillor Vandervis just said, I presume, because the commercial, because of the land values being and their differentials being so much higher, get to cop any rate increase that much higher if this one is kept low.
Correct. If you increase this by more, then there is less to be collected based on the value. So yes.
But because
yes.
the commercial is proportionately so much
yes.
larger, so
yes.
it does skew the system. Yeah, I just think it's one of those fairness things, and I'm just wondering why it is set at the LG, and I can't even recall when that decision was made. Can you?
I can check back for you, but it is a few years ago.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, would someone like to move the recommendations? Move Councillor Staines, second Councillor Hall. Councillor Staines, do you wish to speak to this? Any further speakers? If there are none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No, recorded, please. Right, that's carried, and I believe, subject to advice, that is the last. No, that was the second last one was the wash-up, effectively the wash-up. So, councillors, that is the last item on the agenda. Beaten my record in terms of time. Thank you for what has been a very positive meeting. Bear in mind that what we're doing now is putting out what we have come to the conclusions about to our community to get their feedback. So we look forward to that, and we look forward to considering that feedback from between February and May. So insofar as we may not have another meeting where we're all in one place, can I wish you all a very restful Christmas and a very happy holiday to you all. Thank you.